For these next series of lectures on sensory function of the nervous system, I'm going to start off making some broad, generalized, categorical statements about how things work, and then I'm going to briefly mention specialized modalities such as auditory, hearing, or vestibular, or taste, or olfaction and vision. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I go through a good bit more detail, particularly with vestibular, auditory, and vision in the neuroanatomy course, and I want to basically draw our attention to sensory having to do with skin and pain and touch and things like that. But I did want to start off general. So the idea here is that anything that happens in the central nervous system in terms of neuron to neuron conversation is a function of action potentials and action potential frequencies. So that's basically the grammar of all sensory information, and motor for that matter, is the number of action potentials and how rapidly per unit time what the frequency is. Are the action potential frequencies going up? Are they going down? Etc. So when we're talking about sensory in general, so let's talk again an afferent neuron, and you know afferent means sensory. So you have this neuron here. And the idea is that if you have something in the environment in the form of energy, how do you take that energy and translate or transduce that energy into action potential frequencies? That's basically the general theme of all sensory in our body, is taking some energy out there from the environment and then translating it into some type of action potential frequency. So lots of ways of getting there, and I'm going to talk about some general things here in a second. So you could have some stimulation of energy that happens to maybe interact with receptors on a neuron membrane itself, or you could have some type of energy stimulation, and it then interfaces with some other specialized cell structure, and then that specialized cell structure can release compounds that would then in turn cause action potentials to happen in the sensory neuron or the afferent neuron. So various ways this can work. But the stimulation of the receptors, regardless of the mechanism, is always going to involve the opening of ion channels to depolarize in order to set off a series of action potentials. So just going real brief through here. So you have auditory, that's hearing. So then the question becomes, I got some type of energy out here. How do I take energy that is involving hearing and transduce that into action potential frequencies? So again, real quickly here, what I have is I have for auditory, I've got pressure pulses in the air, so that's my energy source. So how do you transduce pulse pressures in the air, sound waves, into making action potentials and then dialing up or dialing down action potential frequencies? So I believe you have a general notion in terms of how the ear works. You have a tympanic membrane, which of course is your eardrum. You have three ossicles that are going to translate that vibration of the eardrum or the tympanic membrane. That's going to cause fluid in your inner ear to vibrate. And so how do you take that vibration of the fluid in the inner ear and make them cause action potentials? And so what you have in your inner ear, you have these specialized cells, and these cells are little hair processes come on out, and then you're going to have a type of, say, membrane that is over that, and then you're going to have a end of a neuron here, a sensory neuron, and so it's going to be here, and it's going to be pseudounipolar, and then that is going to go into the central nervous system. So the idea is to transduce the pressure pulse or the vibration of fluids, in this case, into action potentials. So you can imagine what you have here is you have these cells with the hair processes. So as the membrane vibrates up and down, it then deflects the hairs on this cell one way or the other. And it's the actual deflection of the hair cells here, or the little processes on the cell, that opens and closes ion channels such that ions can either go in or ions go out. It could be sodium, could be potassium, etc. But you have a movement of ions that causes a depolarization, and you have these little vesicles here. And when the little hair cell is depolarized, it releases those little neurotransmitters. They bind to the receptors there, and now all of a sudden I'm having action potential frequencies going down that sensory neuron. And the more neurotransmitter being released, the higher the frequency. So what we have here now is, again, we have pressure pulses in the fluid. Where the pressure pulses in the fluid come from? They came from the air, which was translated through the eardrum, ossicles, and such, causing a vibration of the membrane in the inner ear, deflects the hair cells. The hair cells alter ion channels, which depolarizes the hair cells, releases neurotransmitters, and off to the races we go in terms of action potential frequencies. So that's how you then transduce energy, pressure pulse in the air, into an electrical activity. And what you'll also find out is in your vestibular system, it works exactly the same way, except what you have is you have fluid in your semicircular canals, part of your vestibular system. So I'm just going to draw this again because it's the same theme here. So I got that, and I've got little hair cells here, and then I'm going to have, my neuron here, sensory neuron, again goes to the C and S. Except this time what you have is that you have fluid here. And so the little processes are into fluid, and then as you are accelerating, as you're changing direction with your head, it's going to cause that fluid to shift in one way or another, which then in turn bends the hair cells one way or another. And then again, now we're back to depolarization of the hair cell, releasing neurotransmitters, and all of a sudden I have action potentials going down that sensory neuron that's associated with the vestibular system. So the theme is the same in terms of hair cells. One is responding to, again, deflection of a membrane. Over here, that's going to be your auditory. The other is going to be deflection of these hair cells because fluid is moving because your head is moving. So that's basically auditory and vestibular. With taste, again, you have some taste molecules or proteins in receptors in your tongue, and again, same theme here. You're going to have your sensory weighting, and as various molecules are going to be binding to those receptors on your tongue, it's going to release neurotransmitters. Again, you're going to have action potentials there. And I'm sure you learned from probably middle school, your basic taste modalities are going to be sweet. So you have some of these that are specified to pick up sweet. You have some that are sensitive to sour stimuli. You have some that are responsive to bitter. You have some that are responding to salty. And then you have some that are going to be umami. Okay, umami, that's kind of a meat taste. Okay, so those are your 5 basic categories of gustatory or taste. And again, it all has to do with these specialized sensors in your tongue that are going to respond to, again, just a combination of molecules that will give you those types of sensory stimulations. Olfaction, pretty similar to taste in the sense of, again, you got specialized cells in your upper nasal cavity. They're going to respond to molecules that bind. And again, here we have a cell just waiting to have action potentials as these molecules in the air binds. And again, you have, again, action potential frequencies. So you're going to translate that into, that's this odor, that's that odor. And again, combination of basic categories can have cause you to have different olfaction types of vision, olfaction types of sensibilities. So, fairly common in terms of taste and olfaction. Again, the theme being you have a specialized cell receptor that binds to molecules, and then it gets translated to having the perception that you have. For vision, I think you have a basic understanding of that. You got rods and cones. So I'm just going to draw that like that. That's going to be a rod, and then a cone is going to be cone-like. Okay, you have that. And then you have photons that are coming in and binding there, photons binding there. And so when the photons are binding to the rods and cones, that's going to alter the neurotransmitter release for these rods and cones. So here we got, again, cells here just waiting to receive those signals. Okay, and then it's going to go to the CNS. And again, you're going to have neurotransmitters in terms of the level being altered in response to the photons striking the rods and the cones. Now, what's interesting about the visual system is that when the rods and cones are receiving photons, they actually are going to inhibit the neurotransmitters. So the actual photons' interaction with rods and cones will actually hyperpolarize. So in darkness, the neurotransmitters will go up, okay, and that will then alter the axial potential frequencies. Now I'm leaving out some steps here because there's a series of neurons that actually interface between rods and cones to the actual neurons that go to the central nervous system. So this is terribly oversimplified. You've got several layers of cells there. I talk a lot about that in the neuroanatomy course. I'm just trying to make things simple here, which the theme being is that you have photons, and then the photons will actually, in this case, inhibit the release of neurotransmitters to the rods and cones, but your central nervous system will interpret that as vision. Of course, the rods are going to be black and white, and cones are going to be color. And all of this, again, is within the retina, which is nervous tissue. So what's kind of interesting, though, is the idea of synesthesia. And so let me kind of lay this out for you. Because you can have sensory information. I'm just going to take some categories here. Taste. And so you receive some type of stimulation with taste, gustatory, and that is going to go to the central nervous system, and it's going to be part of the brain. So central nervous system, let's say part of brain for taste. So when the part of the brain for taste is stimulated, then you have a conscious sensation, oh, I'm tasting something. Maybe it's sweet, maybe it's sour, but I'm tasting something. And then, let's just another example, you have auditory. Okay, same theme here. Okay, it's going to go to the central nervous system, part of brain for hearing. So if that part of the brain is stimulated, I'm going to have a conscious sensation of hearing from the auditory system. And the last one would be vision. Vision, again, is going to go to the CNS, and then part of brain for vision. Okay, so for us to have conscious perception of taste or auditory vision, you've got to stimulate that part of the brain. If you stimulate that part of the brain, you're going to have the subjective experience. So what's really kind of interesting is that there are some people who have a different type of wiring such that if they hear something, then not only does the communication to the part of the brain for hearing get stimulated, but there actually may have fibers that go on and then will communicate with the part of the brain that has to do with taste. Or maybe these auditories are going to then communicate with parts of the brain for vision. So in this situation here, and this is just, again, an example, that if a person they have an auditory experience, they're hearing something, but in the process of being stimulated by hearing, the experience of hearing causes them to have a taste or may cause them to see something. So what you have now is a kind of a cross-modal wiring of various sensibilities. And so there is a subpopulation of people out there that have this kind of cross-wiring multimodality, so that if they have an experience of taste or auditory or vision, that the stimulation of that system will then also stimulate other sensory situations as well. So there could be people out there are people out there, when they hear a sound, they'll have a taste, or they hear a sound, they'll see something, or maybe they see something and it causes a taste, or see something and it causes sounds to happen, again because of this cross wiring. So that condition there is called synesthesia, and someone who has this particular wiring, they're called synesthetes. It's estimated that about 4% of the population has some measure of synesthesia. What is interesting is that the instances of synesthesia is about 6 times greater in females compared to males. So most of your synesthetes are actually females. There tends to be, or is thought that there's a genetic component to synesthesia, because synesthesia tends to run in families. There's lots of stuff on the internet about synesthesia, so if you have time, go Google it. So it's so cool. And you would think that this would be kind of upsetting or confusing to people who have the synesthesia condition, but quite the opposite. The people that have synesthesia view this as a gift. They love having that cross-modal sensory stimulation, one sensory being stimulated, causing multiple sensory brain centers. I've read about other people who are synesthetes, and the synesthetes actually feel sorry for the people who do not have synesthesia, because they'll say that their world of sensation is so much more rich, so much more creative than people that don't have this cross-modal wiring. There is also a correlation in terms of the instances of synesthesia and creativity. So if you go to an art community, it's much more likely that you're going to have a greater percent of synesthetes in an artsy type of population than you would a non-artsy population. So really cool stuff. I hope you spend some time reading about it. It's a very, very interesting topic. Nobody understands why they exist and how that came to be, but it is a pretty cool topic. So again, just to recap, my point here for this page is just to basically make general sweeps in terms of all sensory has to do with trying to transduce something out in the environment into action potentials and variations of frequency of action potentials, because that's the only thing our brain understands, are action potentials and changes in frequencies of action potentials. Okay, so we'll stop there and we'll pick back up and we'll have a little more deep dive in terms of sensory having to do with skin, touch, and pain and things like that, beginning in the next section. So I'll see you there. I want to now pivot to the type of sensory having to do with skin and having to do with conscious sensation of maybe some of our visceral organs and joints and such. And we're going to spend the rest of the sensory block focusing in on that. So lots of different sensory modalities, touch, sensation of temperature, pressure, vibration, proprioception. Proprioception, one type of proprioception is where you are aware of your body position of your extremities. So if your arm is up or down, you don't have to look at your arm to know where it is. You just know where it is. So that would be called conscious proprioception. And then finally, pain. So we have a little table here, and these are categories of fiber types. And in neurospeak, fiber means axon. Okay, so axon types. So we have a kind of a classification scheme. We have 2 of them. We have Erlanger and Gasser, and that would be your A alpha, beta, A delta, C's. And then you have your number classification, and it'd be 1A, 1B, 2, 3, and 4, and such. So a reminder that these fiber types that you see in the table here is sensory. Okay, we do have other fiber types dealing with motor, and those are going to be your A alphas and your A gammas and then your B fibers. So you'll note you don't have A gammas and B fibers in sensory. You do have A alphas both in sensory and motor and sensory. So again, since this is a sensory block, we're only going to focus in on sensory fibers. So what you have here in terms of the scheme is you have your A alphas, and you got two subgroups of those, 1B, 1As, 1Bs, and these are heavily myelinated. So their diameter in microns are 13 to 20, their conduction velocity 80 to 120 meters per second. And I'm going to tell you right now that if you go on the internet or look at a bunch of different textbooks, all of them are going to have variations in these numbers. So the point is not to memorize the numbers. I do not want you memorizing these numbers, but I do want you to have just a general sense of where we are, and also the theme that when we go in this direction here, the smaller the farther down we go, the smaller the diameter of the axon itself and the less myelin that we have. So the most heavily myelinated fibers are going to be your A alphas, and again 13 to 20 in diameter, and the actual potential propagation velocity is going to be from 80 to 120 meters. And then if you go to the next level, A betas, their myelin is a little less thick, their diameter is a little less, and their velocity is a little less. And then you go to your A deltas. The A deltas are just lightly myelinated. You see, you have a big drop off. Now we're down to 1 to 5 microns, and the conduction velocity is 5 to 30. And then we get to the C fibers. The C fibers are not myelinated at all. They're the smallest fibers, and they by far have the slowest conduction velocity. So one of the take-home points here is making the connection between degree of myelin, diameter, and conduction velocity. And again, do not worry about memorizing these numbers, but I do want you to understand that A alpha is faster than A beta is faster than A delta, and A delta is faster than C. And just have a general sense of what type of conduction velocities are we talking about here. Okay, I want to connect now. Why is the thickness of the myelin, what does it have to do with conduction velocity? So let's go back to this, and we're going to go, say, here. Okay, so imagine that we have a sensory neuron. So I'll draw a pseudo-unipolar neuron here, and it is myelinated. And so we have some myelin here, and we have some myelin here. Okay, so we got some myelin going on here. Okay, and we know that these little gaps there are going to be your nodes of Ranvier. So you'll recall in our earlier lecture, we talked about the concept of a length constant. And a length constant has to do with if you have a potential across a membrane, the farther away you get from that initial potential change, you have a drop-off. Okay, remember the diagram here. Okay, so if I'm taking a membrane and I'm putting a battery, and then the farther away you go, the less effect of the battery here, and that has to do with just the nature of the membrane here. The better the insulation of the membrane, the better we're going to have in terms of length constant. So if I got a really well insulated membrane, then the effect of the battery here is felt at greater distances. So again, so we got distance going on here. Okay, in that direction from the original battery depolarization. Okay, that's the length constant. So you know that the smaller the myelin, the smaller the length constant. And if they have a smaller length constant, then that means the nodes of Ranvier have to be closer together to get that saltatory conduction going from node to node to node. So now imagine that I have another sensory neuron, and its myelin is really, really thick. So now here's the myelin there. Okay, but note, so now I can have, because I've got such thick, nice myelin, now the distance of my node of Ranvier is greater. Why is it greater? Because I have a greater link constant. And a greater link constant then allows those nodes to be farther apart, which then means the saltatory conduction goes much more quickly. So that's the connection between degree of myelination and speed of conduction velocity. It has to do with how close or how far apart those nodes can be before you have a successful saltatory conduction. And the thicker the myelin, the farther apart the nodes, which makes for a more rapid communication. So again, looping back around, poor old C fibers here, they have no myelination, so they're going to be relatively slow in terms of their conduction velocity. So again, that's kind of the scheme when we're talking about fiber types or axon fiber types. It has to do, again, with nature of the myelin itself, how thick it is, or maybe no myelin at all. So we're going to end this here now that we have the basic vocabulary, because I'm going to be talking about in the future lectures, I'm going to be talking about A alphas, A betas, A deltas, and Cs and all this. And so, because each of the different sensory modalities have different fiber types associated with them, which means then I have different speeds of communicating a particular sensory modality. We will revisit that in the future lectures. So we'll end this here, and we'll pick back up on the next page next time. For this section here, I want us to focus on what is called mechanoreception. Mechanoreception, you can find these in skin, connective tissue, visceral organs, and they are considered encapsulated. So let me kind of lay this out. What is a mechanoreceptor? A mechanoreceptor is this little organ that's innervated, and it responds to mechanical manipulation. The encapsulated part comes in this way. You have some type of, again, little organ here, and it has multiple layers, okay, of connective tissue, maybe like a little onion here perhaps, and then you would have a neuron that's going right up into that little encapsulated organ there, and there's going to be my sensory neuron there, and it's going off to the central nervous system here. So that organ here, again, it's encapsulated, and so anytime you then manipulate that little end organ, that little encapsulated area there, maybe you're pulling it, stretching it, maybe you're pushing it, maybe you're wiggling it around, but any type of manipulation of this little encapsulated structure, and there are multiple types, causes then changes in the action potential frequency as they are communicating to the central nervous system. So that's what we mean by encapsulated. It literally has layers of connective tissue around it, and it is responding to mechanical manipulation. Okay, so I have a chart here that has basically 5 kinds of receptors that are associated with encapsulated neurons at the distal end, the end that's in either the skin or the connective tissue or the visceral organ. So we're going to go by name and talk about them. So the first up is going to be Meissner corpuscle, and these are going to be your A beta fiber types. Okay, those are the ones that are pretty good myelination, not quite as good as the A alphas, but they have pretty good amount of myelin in them. And in fact, what's going to happen here is that all 5 of these have A betas associated with them. And again, I'm going to go one by one. Another thing here, you see this is it's an RA. RA means rapidly adapting, and I'm going to talk about rapid adaptation on the next page. So you have rapid adaptation and you have slow adaptation. Again, I'll elaborate on that in a minute. So Meissner's rapid adaptation in A beta fibers. So I said you can find them in connective tissue, you can find them in visceral organs. As far as skin, we can basically categorize skin into 2 types. You have your hirsute skin. Hirsute skin means hairy skin, And then you have glabrous skin. Glabrous skin is skin without hair. So where do you have skin without hair? Well, the anterior surfaces of your hands, there's no hair. So that type of skin is called glabrous skin. The other area of your body that has glabrous skin is going to be the soles of your feet. So those are hairless skin. And so the receptors in glabrous skin versus hirsute skin, very, very different. So when it comes to Meissner's, glabrous skin has lots and lots of Meissner corpuscles in there. They rarely will you find a Meissner corpuscle in hirsute or hairy skin. Not to say it's not possible, but dominantly it's going to be found in glabrous skin. So what do these Meissner corpuscles do? What are they good at? Well, they're really good at picking up on vibrations, and they're kind of tuned to be really efficient if the vibration is at a low frequency. And if it's sensitive to vibration, then by definition it has to be sensitive to pressure change, because that's what vibration is. So again, it can sense pressure. Meissner corpuscles are very important for fine touch. So let's talk about what fine touch is. Fine touch is how good are you at discriminating where you're being touched. So let me give you a few examples here. Imagine that I have some skin, okay? And imagine that I am touching you with a sharp object, maybe right there. And so my point is, are you aware that you're being touched here but not here? So the more accurate you are in terms of where you're being touched, the better the fine touch you have. Now, fine touch has another synonym in neurospeak. It's called two-point discrimination. Okay, so two-point discrimination, very, very descriptive here. So two-point discrimination is how good are you at when you're touched to understanding that you may be being touched by 2 points instead of 1 point. So let's do this example here. So what we got is I've got a little, maybe a pin touching you here, and then maybe I have another little pin touching you right there. And maybe the distance there is just a few millimeters. And so I ask you, are you being touched by 1 or 2 points? And if you have really good two-point discrimination, then that means those points are pretty close together and you can still sense that they're actually 2 points touching you. Now, I think you wouldn't be surprised that there's a certain point where you can move this closer and closer and closer, where I can be touching you with 2 points, but you're going to perceive it as 1 point. So that's the limit of fine touch. Of course, if I start moving them outward, again, you're going to easily have a sense that they're going to be 2 points touching me instead of 1 point touching me. So two-point discrimination is basically the same thing as fine touch. And you have multiple mechanoreceptors that are involved in fine touch. And what I'm telling you is that one of them that's very important are going to be your Meissners. Your Meissners are really good to give you a sense of texture of what you're touching. Shape changes in terms of if you're fondling something and it's round and now it's sharper or whatever. Again, Meissners are very important for you making those discriminations. About 40% of the mechanoreceptors of the hand are going to be your Meissners, so really, really common in your hand. The receptive field is larger than the Merkel's but smaller than the Pacinian and the Ruffini. So what is a receptor field? Okay, so let's go back up and do another example here for skin. So again, suppose this is skin, and suppose I have a neuron here. Okay, has some type of encapsulated organ. Okay, so the neuron, whoops, didn't want to do that, so let's try this again. And so the neuron, there's my pseudounipolar, and it goes to the central nervous system. And let's just say the receptor field is going to be right there. So what that is telling you then is that if I touch you here, okay, that is within the receptor field, therefore that neuron is going to respond. But if I touch you here, that is beyond the receptor field, so you're not going to feel anything if that's the only neuron in town. So what that also then means is that the smaller the receptive field, the better you're going to have for two-point discrimination. So imagine then I have a series of these, and they all have really small receptor fields. So I got one here, and I got one here, okay, and I got one here. Okay, it's off going there, and so receptor field here, receptor field here, receptor field here. So now when I'm touching, I can say I'm touching here but not here, or maybe I'm touching here but not there. So you're going to have a sense of where you're being touched because you have all of these very small receptor fields. Imagine another scenario where I now have skin, and maybe my receptive field is quite large. So maybe that's my receptive field. So then when you come in touch, you say, well, okay, I'm being touched here. No, I'm being touched here. No, I'm being touched here. So I can touch you anywhere in that receptor field, and you're not going to be quite as good at figuring out exactly where I'm being touched because of the larger receptive field. So that's what I mean by the Meissners having a receptive field that's a little larger than Merkel's but smaller than the Pacinians and the Ruffinis. You'll find the Meissners in superficial skin, again closer to the surface of the skin. You'll find these Meissners in connective tissues of joints. And so when they're in the connective tissues of joints, that's going to be very important for proprioception. And again, we'll talk about proprioception in a coming lecture. Again, it's having to do with where my body parts are in space. So that's the story on the Meissners. Okay, so next up is going to be the Pacinians, and like the Meissners, they're rapidly adapting, and of course they're A betas. So the Pacinians are also sensitive to vibration and also pressure. The Pacinians are actually better suited to detecting high-frequency vibrations compared to the Meissners, which is better at low-frequency vibrations. The Pacinians are also very important for texture of the surfaces. They respond to stretch. So if you stretch your skin and you're in the area of Pacinian, that stretching can light off the Pacinians to have active potentials down the sensory neurons. You're also going to find Pacinian corpuscles in viscera, and you're going to find them in bone, or at least the connective tissue around the bone. They're going to comprise about 10% of the mechanoreceptors that you find in your hand. So as far as the hand is concerned, many more Meissners than you would Pacinis. They have a larger receptive field compared to the Meissners. You will find the Pacinians in deep skin. So the Meissners are going to be in superficial skin. The Pacinians are going to be in deep skin, and again, you're going to find them in connective tissue of joints, so they're also going to be important for our sense of joint position, which then flows into our conscious proprioception, where our body parts are. Most of the Pacinians are going to be in your glabrous skin. You'll have a few in your hair skin, but again, dominantly you're going to find these in the palm, the bottom of your feet and the anterior surface of your hands. The next one up is the Merkels, and unlike the Meissners and the Pacinians, the Merkels are slow adapters, but again also A betas. They're going to respond to stretch, just like the Pacinians did. They're responsible for pressure. Not so much for vibratory sense, but certainly they can feel pressure on your skin. These two are also very important for fine touch. You have many, many of these in your fingertips. You'll find these in the genital mucosa, and you'll find these inside your mouth. And they're going to comprise about a quarter of the mechanoreceptors of the hand. And they have the smallest of receptor fields of all of the encapsulated sensories here. They're really, really, really small. And so if you have a very small receptive field, then that tells you, okay, these are super important for great fine touch. Again, you'll find these superficial skin. You can also find these in the connective tissue of joints. So again, play a role in proprioception. Again, these are going to be dominantly in your glabrous skin, but you can find some in your hair skin. And then the next one is going to be the Ruffinis, slow adapter, A betas. These again response to stretch, to pressure. These can actually get in the act of sensing temperature, and we'll talk about that in a future block. You'll have these associated with hair follicles, and so the Ruffini's with hair follicles, if the hair follicle is deflected or bent, the Ruffini's in the neighborhood can then give you a sense of the direction that hair follicle is being deformed to. You'll find Ruffini's in your tendons. You'll find them that they also comprise about 25% of the mechanoreceptors in your hand, and they have the largest receptor field of all of these four that we mentioned. The Ruffini's have by far the largest receptive field, which means they're not particularly great when it comes to fine touch, but they are also handy in other things. You'll find these deep in the skin, and you'll also find these in connective tissue of the joints. Lastly are going to be the hair follicle itself. Now the hair follicle innervation, a little bit complex. You've got multiple fiber types that are associated with hair follicles, A betas, A deltas, and C fibers. These are slow adapters. And so again, let's go so skin here, and then suppose you have a hair, okay? So I have a hair follicle here, and there's my hair. So what you're going to have then is you're going to have a neuron that's going to be kind of wrapping in there and then comes out and then is communicating to the central nervous system. So now if I have any type of deflection, it's going to light that off, and I'm going to have action potentials here. So again, but you got multiple types of fibers that can be associated with hair follicles. Again, your A betas, A deltas, and your C fibers. Remember, C fibers are the slowest of all. So they're very sensitive to hair deflection, and of course you don't have these obviously in glaber skin because there's no hair, but you have many of these in hirsute or hair skin itself. Okay, and these are going to be the main mechanoreceptors that you're going to find in hirsute skin. So here is a nice little cartoon. This is the last page we'll do on this one, but what we have here is going to be a cartoon kind of showing us, okay, these in your fingertip, there's your Merkels, again the smallest of the receptor fields, your Ruffini's, very large receptor fields, and Meissner's come in second, and Pacinians come in, I guess, in the third spot there. So you have that, and I also remember said that some of these receptors are in superficial skin, some are in deep skin. So your Pacinians and your Ruffini's are in deep skin, so that's deep here, and that's deep here, and then the superficial is going to be your Meissner's and your Merkels. Now let's go ahead and define what rapid adapting and slow adapting is, and we'll wrap this section up. So what happens if you have a rapid adapting type of receptor? A rapid adapting type of receptor is a receptor that's really, really sensitive to change. And then once you do the change, then the signal slows down profoundly or even stops. So take, for example, your Meissner corpuscles and your Pacini corpuscles. So the Meissner corpuscles, if you have, again, some type of pressure on it, you're going to be, here's a texture, and part of texture is going to be pressure. And so all of a sudden now you're feeling some roughness, and so all of a sudden you can have a rapid firing of these action potentials, but then if you you're not changing the texture, then basically the action potentials go to nothing. And so as long as you have that stimulation, it'll be sensitive to change, but then it stops and you don't perceive it. And then when you lift off, and now you're going to have a little bit of activity. So rapidly adapting means they rapidly adapt to change. So once they've adapted, they become semi-silent. Same thing with your Pacinian corpuscles. Again, rapidly adapting, you have a flurry of activity and then nothing, and then a flurry of activity when you change. So you can imagine that if you have something on your skin, and my example would be maybe a ring or a watch or something that's touching your skin, when you first put it on and it's putting a little pressure on your skin, you're aware of it, but then after a while you're no longer aware of it. Those are rapidly adapting receptors. In the slow adapting receptors, which are going to be your Ruffini's and your Merkels, those you might have again an increase, or you'll have a rapid increase in action potentials when they're being stimulated. But as long as you have the stimulation there, you're going to be having action potentials. So those are slow adapting. As long as you're being stimulated, they're not going to go silent on you. You're going to be aware of whatever's touching you is in fact touching you. So again, of these, half of them are rapid adapters. Okay, that's a rapid adapter, that's a rapid adapter, this is slow adapter, and slow adapter here. We're going to find the same thing when we're talking about thermoreceptors, because some, again, they can be rapidly adapting, and I think we all have this experience. You go in, you take a bath, and the water is very warm, so you first jump into it, and it feels really, really warm. And then after a minute, it doesn't feel warm at all. And it's not necessarily because the water has gotten cooler, maybe it has a little bit, but part of it is you've just adapted to the new warm temperature. Same thing when you go swimming in the ocean. You jump in the ocean, the water is cold and feels really cold, but after you're there for a couple of minutes, now it doesn't feel so cold. Again, that's just an example of rapid adaptation. It's sensitive to the change in temperature, but once you get there, then it adapts and it doesn't feel as intense as when you first jumped in the pool. So again, just different types of applications of the concept of rapid adapting and slowly adapting. Okay, so we'll end this here, pick back up on next time, but hopefully the rapid adapting, slow adapting will help you understand what we have here in terms of these mechanoreceptors. My goal for this section is to help you understand the concept of lateral inhibition, very important for tactile acuity. You also see this theme in other sensory systems as well. You have lateral inhibition when it comes to your visual. You have lateral inhibition when it comes to hearing. Again, I'll talk a little more about that in the neuroanatomy course. But let's get down this concept of lateral inhibition. First of all, let's get our orientation on this first drawing here. So what we have is we have skin, and I want to emphasize that what's happening up here is central nervous system, so it's either going to be spinal cord or brain stem, depends on which nerves we're talking about. And so there's if you're talking spinal cord, there's your DRG, so there's your pseudo-unipolar neurons there. And so what we have here now is going to be sensory fields. Okay, that's a sensory field, that's a sensory field, that's a sensory field. So what you have here, I'm going to erase that so it's less busy, but what you have here is you have intercepting or overlapping sensory fields. So looking at this, what the point of the drawing is, it is if you stimulate where this red circle is, okay, so you're touching that, so you're going to be lighting off action potentials of that particular DRG or that particular afferent neuron, and it's going to be talking to the central nervous system, and you're going to feel touched there. So the question is, though, is what kind of help can you give it so that you're being touched there and say not there? Well, that's what lateral inhibition is all about. So what's happening here is that when you're being touched there, again, you're having then a sensation, I am being touched here. So your action potential frequency is going to be shooting up right there. But what happens is that the adjacent sensory fields actually become inhibited. So suppose before you were being touched, what you would have would be kind of a baseline level, okay, of action potential frequencies. Okay, so that's just kind of your baseline. So now nothing, so if you have this, you have very little awareness that anything's touching you, but again, you have kind of a baseline spattering of action potentials. And then when you get touched, you're going to have a lot of action potentials there. And so this is going to go up, but then you're going to start inhibiting here and here. So now that actually is going to be less action potential frequencies than normal. So what you're doing is you're being touched here, but then you're suppressing the signal from the adjacent receptor fields. And so what this does, if you're stimulating this and then at the same time depressing that, it gives you a better sense that I'm being touched there as opposed to anywhere else. So it's, in a sense, the surrounding receptor fields are being dialed down so that you can have a greater sense of subjective experience that you're being touched here and not here and not here. Well, how does this lateral inhibition scheme work? And so this is where I want to go to the next cartoon. Here, down here, you can see, pencil touching you here. So you're going to have, again, a burst of activity here. But you're actually going to have in the sensory fields there, it actually is going to be a drop in your actual potential frequencies of these lateral fields here to accentuate that the pencil is touching there. Okay, so how does this work in terms of the central nervous system? Well, again, very careful here. Let's take a look at this. So what we have here is this is skin, okay, and so I'm having a field here, I'm having a field here, and then I'm having a field here. So you have, again, your overlapping fields here. So you're being touched right there, and so now lots and lots of action potentials. So this is central nervous system here. So all of this red box is occurring either in the spinal cord or the brain stem. So what you have is you have little itty-bitty neurons called interneurons. And these are little local neurons here. So there's an interneuron there. Here's an interneuron there. Got one there. Got one there. Itty-bitty little neurons. These are called interneurons, or sometimes you'll hear them as internuncial neurons. So you have these again, neurons coming from the skin. So this would be assembling my DRG here, dorsal root ganglia here. Okay, and so they're going in. So this green here, this one being touched, so it's going to come in and it's going to stimulate this secondary neuron within your spinal cord or your brain stem. So I'm going to have an increase in action potentials for the primary sensory neuron. It's going to go into, say, the spinal cord, and it'll synapse onto a secondary sensory neuron, and it will also then increase its action potential, mirroring what you see here. But what's kind of cool, and this is where you really have to think, and that is I have this internuncial neuron there, and I have that internuncial neuron right there. So what is it doing? Well, let's see here. What it is doing is I am stimulating this neuron here, and I'm stimulating this neuron here. So, and I'm stimulating this neuron here. So this green guy here is stimulating that neuron. So note I got action potential frequency going up here, but it's also stimulating that neuron and that neuron. Well, what are these two neurons wanting to do? Well, if you look at them, these neurons here are inhibitory neurons. So look at what they're doing there. They are releasing inhibitory neurotransmitters. Typically it's going to be GABA or glycine. Okay, GABA or glycine. And so these are inhibitory neurons. So they're going to be dropping off the glycine. This would be L-G-L-Y. Let me go ahead and spell it out. Glycine there. So you have the glycine or the GABA, glycine or the GABA. And so what it's doing is it is then trying to shut this neuron down here. So now I'm having a reduction in the action potential frequencies on the sides here. Because when you touch right there, you may be slightly stimulating this guy and slightly stimulating that guy, because this touch right here is on the edge of this guy's receptor field and on the edge of this guy's receptor field here. So touching here lights off this neuron and that neuron. Well, that may confuse you. Are you being touched here? Are you being touched here? Are you being touched here? You see how that could create a problem, because I'm having these overlapping sensory fields. So what happens if, in fact, I'm being touched there, then these internuncial neurons, they're going to be stimulated. They're going to then tap down the signal here and the signal here, dropping the action potential here. So this is what you're perceiving in the central nervous system, is that I'm being touched here, but not here and not there. It has to do, again, with these inhibitory interneurons. So let me clean this up and make another couple of points here. Okay, and so you may be asking, okay, well then what do these guys do here and these guys do here? Well, these guys would be, again, stimulated if I was in fact being touched here. So again, it's just a matter of shifting over one frame, and because I could have a series of a neuron there, neuron there, neuron there, so forth, so on. So regardless of where you're on the skin, you're going to be have this lateral inhibition. And again, the take-home point here is that it helps to sharpen where you are. So it's going to sharpen the stimulatory effect where you're being touched, and at the same time you're tapping down the lateral areas that gives you a much better sense of localization. And again, kind of a summary cartoon that shows that. So again, that's a very important concept, is lateral inhibition. Has everything to do with these internuncial neurons. Okay, so last thing, and I've already talked about this for this little section here, is fine touch, which is same thing as 2-point discrimination, or 2-point touch determines density of receptor fields. 2-point discrimination, fine touch. So what you're doing here, again, like I said, of course, a prettier diagram here. I have these overlapping sensory fields, and I'm being touched here. And so if I'm having overlapping and I'm being touched here and being touched here, I'm going to be more likely able to say, hey, I'm being touched by 2 points instead of 1 point. If I have just one sensory field there and I'm being touched here and here, since it's just one sensory field, then I'm going to perceive this as one touch, not being touched by 2 points. So this one, my perception is going to be 2-point touching, and this one is going to be 1-point touching, despite the fact that I'm actually having 2 points here. So again, as I said earlier, the degree of fine touch, in other words, how good at you are determining in terms of 2-point touching, is going to be a function of two things. One is going to be size of receptive field. Size of receptive field, okay? The other is going to be the number of receptive fields. Okay, so if I have skin and I've got a lot of receptive fields and they're very small, okay, so, and it means I got a lot of neurons servicing this area of skin here, then that means being touched here versus here. I've got really good awareness of exactly where I'm being touched. Also, what this means is that I can make these points really close together and still determine that I'm being touched by 2 points as opposed to 1 point. So it all has to do with the size of the receptor field. Smaller is better, but you have to have a lot of them. And so if you have a lot of receptor fields and they're very small, then you're going to be really good at 2-point discrimination. So what's kind of interesting, it's my last point here, is that you don't have the same degree of fine touch function all over your body. That would be a waste of resources. So there are some areas of your body that's really important for you to have really good fine touch or 2-point discrimination. There are other parts of your body where it's really not that important. And so what's cool here is that if you look at your fingertips, and common sense would tell you that you have to have really good fine touch in your fingertips. 2-point discrimination is good down to about 3 millimeters. What that means is that if I have a point here and a point here and they are 3 millimeters apart, I can still tell that I have 2 points. Now if I go 1 millimeter apart, okay, and I touch you in 2 places, you're going to perceive it as one touch. In other words, 1 millimeter is just too close. But your fingertips pretty good, so 2 points, you can get closer down to about 3 millimeters across, and you're still able to say, yeah, I'm being touched by 2 points. Which is kind of crazy, is that if you do the 2-point discrimination test on your lower back, 52 millimeters. That's over 5 centimeters. So if I were on back skin, okay, I could have a point here and a point here, and 4 centimeters apart from the 2 points, I'll touch you on your lower back. And if the points are 4 centimeters apart, you will still perceive that as only being touched by 1 point. So you really are terrible at 2-point discrimination in your lower back. Your 2-point discrimination in the back of your thigh is not that great. Back of your calf is not that great. And again, it's not that great because you don't need it to be that great. You know, functionally, who cares what kind of 2-point discrimination you have on your lower back or the back of your thigh? But if you're talking about 2-point discrimination in your fingertips, and you also have really good 2-point discrimination around your lips, okay, you're really good at that. So those are the areas of your skin where you have the best 2-point discrimination, and for obvious reasons. So anyway, so that's the point for 2-point discrimination. And so again, the goal here was, one, to help you understand the general concept of lateral inhibition. That helps you to sharpen where you're being touched. And the other is, again, going back to understanding what fine touch is, or 2-point discrimination. And again, all of these are going to be involving the mechanoreceptors that we talked about in an earlier lecture. All right, we'll pick up next time, and next time we'll talk a little bit about sensing temperature. So see you next time. I want to spend a little bit of time with you talking about thermoception. That's our ability to recognize varying temperatures, whether it's warm or whether it's cold, regarding the environment. So thermoception, or our ability to sense temperature, is dominated by free nerve endings. And we have 2 general categories of thermoreceptors, or thermoneurons. One class is going to be warm, and the other class is going to be cold. Now, when we're talking about free nerve endings, we're talking about A deltas, which are slightly myelinated, and then the C fibers, which are not myelinated at all. Now, if you get into the literature and look at, warm neurons, cold neurons, and these various receptors, you'll have variation in terms of, is it C fibers that dominate, is it A delta fibers that dominate, warm, cold, etc. There's a lot more to be worked out in the literature on this, so I'm not going to get into that. I'm just happy for you to understand that the dominant player for thermoreceptors and fiber types are going to be free nerve ending, A deltas, and C fibers, both for cold and warm. Now, you do have some neurons that have Ruffini receptors, and of course those neurons are going to be your A betas, so they're heavily myelinated pretty fast, except the neurons, the A betas that have Ruffini in them that are designed for temperature, and this is going to be for warmth, these are going to be in the deep skin. So if it's deep skin, then that probably means it's not the front line most sensitive receptors for warmth, but I put them in there because they do play a role in warm temperatures. Now, when we're talking about warm or cold, we're talking about receptors that are sensitive to temperature. So for warm, we're talking about a type of receptor, and it's called a TRPV1 receptor. There are others. There's TRPV1, there's TRPV2, TRPV3, TRPV4. So there are multiple types of receptors that are functioning as thermal warm receptors. But the TRPV1 is probably one of the more best characterized, but there are others. When it comes to cold, the major receptor, or the best well-characterized receptor, is going to be your TRPM8. Again, there are others, but the TRPM8 is one that's pretty well characterized. Now, when you're talking about whether it's warm or cold, and you have these receptors that are responsive to temperature, it's not that you just simply have one set of warm neurons and one set of cold neurons. Within the set of warm neurons, or neurons that are designed to detect warmth, you have a heterogeneous group there. They all have various thresholds. So you're going to have specific warm neurons, or neurons that are designed to detect a certain temperature range in the warmth, and then another set of neurons that would detect maybe slightly warmer temperature, and then another set of neurons for a slightly warmer temperature. So it's a heterogeneous group even within the warm neurons. Same thing with cold. You have, again, subsets of cold neurons, and each of them have their various thresholds. So again, a slightly cold temperature or cool temperature would set off one set of neurons, and if the temperature drops, then another set of neurons would light off in terms of action potentials and so forth. One of the concepts that I want us to bear in mind, though, is that this is a chain event trying to communicate to the cerebral cortex so that you have conscious awareness of warmth or cold. So for example, let's just have a dorsal root ganglia there, and these are going to be our free nerve endings there. And so maybe we have some TRPM8 receptors sitting here. And so if we're exposing this sensory neuron to cool temperatures, that's going to change the action potential frequency of this neuron here, and this neuron here is going to then synapse onto a secondary neuron. Okay, and that secondary neuron is either going to be in the spinal cord or brain stem, and then that secondary neuron will then synapse onto a tertiary neuron and then series of neurons, so that eventually is going to be talking to a neuron in your cerebral cortex. And when that neuron is stimulated, then you have the conscious sensation, oh, this must be cold. But again, even with this scheme here, again, this would be considered a cold neuron. You have multiple subtypes of cold neurons that are going to be synapsing on different secondaries, which are synapsing on different tertiaries and so forth, which will end up synapsing on different neurons in the cortex for degrees of coldness. And we can do the same thing if we're talking about warm neurons. Okay, so I have another neuron here. Again, either the DRG or could be a ganglia in part associated with your cranial nerves. Same thing with the cold. You have neurons that are associated with your cranial nerves that sense coldness or warmness in your mouth and your nose and the skin of your face, etc. So again, I've got free nerve endings here, and maybe the TRPV1s are sitting here. Okay, it's going to then synapse onto a secondary neuron, okay, and that's either going to be in spinal cord or brainstem, and that's going to go to a tertiary, and then it will go and connect with neurons in your cortex for conscious appreciation for, warm temperatures of varying degrees. And again, it is a heterogeneous group. So you have many subtypes of cold neurons, and you have many subtypes of warm neurons that are going to, again, respond to varying temperatures, but it is a heterogeneous group. So what I want to do now is to talk a little bit more about that TRPV1. The TRPV1 receptor itself, it's a protein in a cell membrane in the free nerve endings, and it's functioning as a cation channel, and so it's thought to be basically working with letting in calcium and sodium when it opens up. When the calcium and sodium goes in, it alters the action potential frequency in the neuron, and then off to the races we go down the chain of neurons, eventually influencing what goes on in the cerebral cortex itself. So the TRPV1 is a type of receptor, and it is under the class called villonoid receptors. So villonoid receptors is umbrella class of receptors. Within the villonoid receptors, one of them is going to be your TRPV1. Like I said, there are others. And they're going to be, again, sensing warm temperatures. Now, what's really interesting about this is not only can the TRPV1 receptors respond to change in temperature, they can also respond to chemical stimulation as well. So you all know there are certain creams that you can buy. You put it on your skin, and it makes your skin feel warm. Well, it's not because the cream is making the skin hot. It's just that that chemical is interacting with the TRPV1, giving you the sensation of warmth. So there are chemicals that can do that. You have certain pH changes. If you take some acid and rub on your skin, it's going to give you a warm sensation. So these TRPV1s not only can interact with certain chemicals, it's also responsive to pH changes as well. So one of the better characterized molecules or compounds that can interact with the TRPV1 is going to be capsaicin. And capsaicin is the ingredient in chili peppers that makes chili peppers hot. So if you bite down on a chili pepper, your tongue is going to have this kind of a burny type of warm sensation. Again, it's just a type of bilinoid receptor, TRPV1, responding to capsaicin. You have capsaicin-sensitive TRPV1 receptors in your mouth, obviously, but you have them in your eyes, you have them in your nose, you have them in your respiratory system, many places on your body. So a capsaicin-like compound that touches, say, your eyes or up in your nose, again, can have that same warm, even uncomfortably burning or hot sensation. Which is why capsaicin is actually an ingredient in pepper spray. So if you spray somebody with pepper spray, their eyes are going to be feeling very warm to the point of pain. Now, I'm going to talk about pain in a later lecture, so I'm not going to go into pain right now. But what I'm saying is that one of the characteristics of the TRPV1s is they not only can respond to temperature change, but they can also respond to chemical change as well. We have a similar story going on with the cold receptors, okay, and we're talking about the TRPM8s there, and again, these are not the only ones. But the TRPM8s fall under the class of melanostatin receptors. So the melanostatin receptors kind of cousins to the vilanoid receptors, except they're going to be, again, having this umbrella of receptors, one of which is the TRPM8. And so like the vilanoid receptors, it is thought that the TRPM8 is probably going to be calcium-sodium channels. They open up, calcium-sodium flows in, changes the frequency action potentials in the neuron, and then off to the races we go in terms of stimulating the cortex for conscious sensation for cold. And again, like the TRPV1, the TRPM8 are also sensitive to chemicals. And so one of the chemicals that it's sensitive to is going to be menthol. And so menthol is found in mint. So if you eat a mint, you have this cool sensation in your mouth. And you also know that there are creams and such that you can rub on your skin, and it gives a kind of a cool type of sensation. Again, as those chemicals are just simply interacting with your TRPM8 receptors, giving you the sense of coolness. Research does suggest that the TRPM8 receptors are sensitive to mild cold, whereas you get even more cold, the TRPM8s tend to quiet down, and then you have other cold receptors that are going to be activated in even colder temperatures. So that's kind of the story in terms of the TRPV1 and the TRPM8. And again, one, they're well characterized, and two, these are two receptors that are well known to not only be responsive to thermal change, but also responsive to chemical change. Other kind of cool, interesting things about thermoreceptors is that we have rather limited ability to detect temperature change. So if I were to have you grab, say, a metal bar, and if I were able to control the temperature of that metal bar, and maybe the metal bar was, say, 65 degrees, you would perceive that as kind of coolness. And then I were to lower it to, say, 60 degrees, you would feel that it was more cold, 55, more cold, all the way down to 45 degrees. But once I get too much below 45 degrees, you lose the ability to distinguish cold. So if I were to have you take a bar and that is set at, say, 35 degrees, and then grab a bar that was set at 25 degrees, you could not tell that the 25-degree bar was colder than the 35-degree bar. So you lose the ability to discriminate degrees of coldness below 45 degrees. Now, if it gets really cold, you're going to start, again, setting off pain receptors, and again, I'll hold off on that to the lecture where we talk about pain. You have the same thing going on with warm temperatures. So if you were to grab a bar and it's 90 degrees, it would feel warm, 95 warmer, 100 degrees warmer. So you can feel degrees of warmth until you get about 120 degrees. Once you get beyond that, you lose the ability to distinguish degrees of warmth. So a metal piece that was 130 degrees versus a metal piece that was 140 degrees, you'll just perceive that as being pretty warm, but you won't be able to distinguish the two temperatures. And again, there's a certain degree of warmness where now you're tripping off pain receptors, and again, that's going to be another lecture. Another thing that's kind of interesting, and I know you know what I'm talking about with this, but if you are maybe going to a swimming pool and you jump into the swimming pool and the pool is kind of cool, then you have this real sense of uncomfortable coolness. But then after you've been in the swimming pool for a little while, all of a sudden you become acclimated to it, and now and the pool doesn't feel as cold anymore. Same thing with a warm bath. You draw a warm bath, you put your feet in it, and oh my, this is really warm. But then once you're in the bathtub for a few minutes, and all of a sudden it doesn't feel as warm anymore. And it has as much to do with the fact that you've adjusted to the warm temperature as it is that you've lost some heat from the tub of water, and maybe you've lost a little bit of heat. But most of the reason that the water doesn't feel as warm is, again, you have adjusted to that. So what we're talking about here is rapid adapting and slow adapting. And we talked about this earlier. Rapid adapting receptors, they're very sensitive to change, so you'll get a flurry of activity when you go from one temperature to another temperature, but after you are at that temperature, then those neurons kind of quiet down. So basically, getting used to the cool water in the swimming pool or the warm water in the bathtub, that's mostly a function of your rapidly adapting thermoreceptors that are quieting down. You do have intermediate receptors as well, which is why the tub of water still feels warm, but not as warm as when you first put your body into it. Another kind of interesting thing is that thermoreceptors are more sensitive to rapid change in temperature as opposed to gradual change in temperature. So again, if I were to ask you to grab a metal bar, and if I had control of the temperature on the metal bar, and you're grabbing it, and then I'm raising the temperature or lowering the temperature, say 10 degrees every minute, you're going to be pretty good at detecting that change in temperature. But if I were to alter the temperature of the bar, say 1 degree per minute, you're going to be far less sensitive to the change in the temperature. Why? Because rapid adaptation. I'm changing the temperature so slowly that the rapid adapters are maybe detecting a little bit of change, but then they quiet down. So again, we're more sensitive to rapid changes in temperature than we are very gradual changes in temperature. And again, this has to do with just rapid adapting receptors. Again, as I said, some thermoreceptors are actually intermediate adapting. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that we have different sensitivities to temperature if we're talking about glabrous skin versus hirsute skin. Glabrous skin, as you know, skin on the palms of your hands or your fingertips or the bottom of your feet, doesn't have any skin. They're actually more sensitive to temperature, particularly heat, compared to hirsute skin. Again, you have some differences in coolness as well, because they're pretty sensitive. They're more sensitive to coolness than they are, than it is compared to hirsute skin. So your glabrous skin, the fingertips, the palms of your hands, they're by and large more sensitive to a change in temperature than hair skin. But it seems to be really the case when we're talking about heat detection itself. What is also kind of amazing or interesting is that your receptive fields, we talked about that earlier, are really small. We're talking about maybe a millimeter, but you don't have as many of them. In a square centimeter, you may have 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 10. So they're not overlapping. So they are, can be, apart a ways. But if you think about it, the function of the temperature is really more just ambient temperature of the air. It's not that important that you know exactly what the temperature is at an exact point on your skin. Now, again, we'll talk about later if you're burning or if you're freezing and it's painful. Now we're getting into nociception and pain. Again, talk about that later. The ability of skin is not uniform in terms of cold and warm. You actually have parts of your skin that are more sensitive to cold and other parts of your skin that are more sensitive to warm. It just depends upon the distribution of the cold neurons and the warm neurons. So again, point being is the localization of temperature really isn't that important. So anyway, so that's kind of a whirlwind tour of thermoception, thermoreceptors, cold neurons, warm neurons, and such. And again, the pointing out the fact that you have these thermoreceptors that can also be sensitive to chemicals. Okay, so we'll see you next time. Let's take a few minutes and talk about the sensory modality we call proprioception. Another word for that is kinesia. There are two kinds of proprioception. One is called conscious proprioception. Conscious proprioception is where, or my awareness of where my body parts are in space. In other words, if you held your hand up, you don't have to look at your hand to know where it is. You simply know where it is. Or if I were to ask you to close your eyes and with both of your index fingers bring your hands towards your nose and touch the tip of your nose with your eyes closed, you can do that. The reason you can do that is because you have a way of knowing where your fingertips are in space relative to the tip of your nose. So that is conscious proprioception. The second one is unconscious proprioception, and you'll also hear that referred to as reflex proprioception. And that type of proprioception has to do with your tissue, your muscles, your joints and such, talking back to your central nervous system, telling the motor part of your central nervous system what's going on as you try to execute a coordinated movement. So let's illustrate this. We got a box over here, and we're just going to say let that be or symbolize a brain. So imagine then I have, say, a muscle out here, a little skeletal muscle, and I am wanting to cause that skeletal muscle to have some measure of contraction, trying to execute a coordinated movement. So I have part of my brain here, and we're just going to say that's going to be my motor part of my brain. It's going to send an axon out, and it's going to be releasing its acetylcholine, causing that muscle to contract. Well, if the muscle is going to contract and it's going to be in a coordinated way, I really need for the muscle to have a way to talk back to the brain. So this is where we have another pathway then, and we'll go red here. So I have to have some sensory information coming from the muscle itself, and so that's going to be my sensory neuron there, and it's going to go to, and let's just say another part of the brain here, and it's going to talk there. In this part of the brain here, actually it's going to be the cerebellum. Okay, so now the cerebellum is learning what the muscle is doing because I have these sensory fibers associated with that skeletal muscle. So it's going to talk back to the cerebellum, and then the cerebellum in turn is going to send some neurons, and I'm oversimplifying here, but it's going to send some neurons back to the motor area of the brain to refine the movement so that you can execute that coordinated movement that you want to do. So this is a loop. So I communicate to the muscle, do X, Y, Z. The muscle then talks back to the central nervous system via the cerebellum. The cerebellum, through a series of neuronal connections, will then talk back to the motor system, modifying the signal going to the muscle. So all of this is what we're talking about when we're talking about reflex proprioception, because it is below the level of consciousness. Now, if we go to another one, we'll see, here we go, green there. Okay, so I also have a different set of sensory neurons associated with that muscle. Okay, right there. And it's going to go to a different part of the brain. In this part of the brain here, we're just going to say your conscious awareness. Okay, so it's going to talk to that part of the brain, conscious awareness. So now it is using information from this muscle here to give you a sense of where a body part is in space. Now, there's more involved than just the muscle, because we're going to have Golgi tendon organs and joint capsule receptors are also going to be talking back so that you have a sense of awareness of where you are in space. So the drawing's a little simplified. But the big point here is that these are two different systems. And with the awareness part of it, obviously, I'm aware. But with the reflex proprioception, that goes on below the level of consciousness. So again, for the motor, we got a really important feedback loop here that's critical for executing a coordinated movement. So that's kind of a big picture of what's going on, but the emphasis here is that these are different tracks. So I have sensory information coming from skeletal muscle and other organs, joints and Golgi tendons that are talking both to the cerebellum and to the part of the brain that gives me awareness, but those are two different tracks. So let's get into a little more detail in terms of what's going on. So let's take a look at Golgi tendon organ. You'll see this in the literature as a GTO. You'll find the Golgi tendon organ is an interface between the skeletal muscle and the tendon, and I have a lovely little drawing here. So that is my skeletal muscle there, and obviously that's my tendon. So I have some collagen-like connective tissue that is the interface between the skeletal muscle and the tendon, and I have some sensory information coming from that. So again, this is going to be, going there, going to my brain. And these are going to be measuring several things regarding what's going on with the interface between skeletal muscle and tendon. It's going to be conveying tensile load. In other words, how tight is that? What's the load on this interface between muscle and tendon? Of course, if the muscle is contracting more robustly, then obviously you're going to have a greater load on that tendon. It will also communicate rate of change in the tension at the distal end of the muscle group. So it's two very important things. One is the load. How much tension is there on the tendon, and the other is what is the rate of change. So both of those are really important to talk to the central nervous system so that it can then give you that, again, conscious sense of awareness, and then also influence the motor function as well. So these fibers here, this is going to be 1B. Again, that's going to be your A alphas, heavily myelinated. So these are the fastest, really fast fibers because of all the myelin around that. And these are slow adapters. So that's one component of the proprioception. Another component is going to be a joint capsule and ligament receptors. I don't have a drawing for that, but I think you can easily imagine that. You have connective tissue around a given joint, and of course you have connective tissue associated with the ligament as well. So you have sensors there that are also feeding back to both the cerebellum for motor function and the part of your brain that has conscious awareness. Again, and that gets integrated in terms of the angle of the joint, which helps you understand where your body parts are in space if we're talking about the awareness part. That's not the only innervation of joint capsules and ligaments. Obviously, you have lots of free nerve endings for pain and such, but the focus here is just basically what's the innervation that's going to communicate back from joints and ligaments around the joints back to the central nervous system. So what you have is a Golgi tendon-like organ. So it's similar to the Golgi tendon organ, except it's embedded in areas around the joint capsule. You have Pacinian corpuscles, Ruffini corpuscles, and these are a collection of A alphas, 1B, A betas, 2. So they are coming out in terms of the joint capsules. So it's a mix of fibers, all of them pretty fast. To let you know what's going on if we're talking awareness. And then the last one is going to be the muscle spindle itself. And again, this is a skeletal muscle here, as you can tell. So these are extrafusal fibers. And that's going to be the majority of your muscle mass. So that's, when you go out and you eat a steak, you're eating extrafusal fibers. And then you have these itty bitty little small fibers called intrafusal fibers. Okay, and the drawing is weird in the sense it's not to scale. The mass of extrafusal fiber is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times more than the intrafusal fibers. But they've drawn the intrafusal fibers rather large so that you can see them in the context of extrafusal fiber. So the intrafusal fibers are also called a muscle spindle. So as far as information regarding what the muscle is doing, the only way the muscle can communicate back to the central nervous system, and now I'm talking about that neuron right there, is that it has these sensory endings that are associated with the muscle spindle itself, and these muscle spindles can also contract, and they contract in tandem with the extrafusal fibers. So whatever the muscle is doing in terms of degree of contraction, rate of contraction, these intrafusal fibers or these muscle fibers are doing the same thing. I mean, they have to, because the whole point of having these things innervated is to communicate accurately back to the central nervous system what the extrafusal fibers are doing. So that's your feedback there. And so all of this, again, gets integrated in the cerebellum for reflex proprioception, and the signal is also integrated in talking to the part of the brain where I'm aware of where my body parts are. This probably is the most important in terms of your proprioceptions. Certainly the Golgi tendon and the joint capsules and ligament receptors are useful, but the muscle spindles are the major player here. Reason we say that is because they can, in terms of clinical evidence, you have patients who have artificial joints and they destroyed a lot of the connective tissue around the artificial joints. There may be some diminution of joint angle awareness, but it's only minor, which then implies or implicates that particularly the intrafusal fiber messaging is really critical and the most important in terms of awareness of where your joints are and your body parts are in space, and also the reflex proprioception. So that's kind of a summary of the various types of proprioceptions we have and a basic explanation. Of course, with the muscle spindles, again, we have the A alphas, the 1As. We also have some A betas, so I'm going to put that in there as well, and those are type 2s. And then these are slow adapters as well. All right, so that's that. So I want to close by showing you or explaining what a deep tendon reflex is. A deep tendon reflex is that if you were to put a force on a tendon, and that force on the tendon then is going to give a quick yank to the muscle that the tendon is attached to, you'll actually make that muscle then twitch, or you'll make it have a quick jerk. So you're all aware of this when you go to a physician and your legs are hanging down over the table, and then the physician takes a mallet and taps that patellar tendon here. Okay, that patellar tendon is right down there. When you deliver energy here, then that is going to stretch the intrafusal fibers in your quadricep muscle here. And so if you give that a quick stretch, the sensory comes back. There's your DRG there. It comes back, and it is going to make one synapse onto the motor neuron that is then in turn stimulating this muscle to contract. So if I give the muscle spindle a quick yank, which is achieved by taking a mallet and tapping the tendon, I'm going to have a monosynaptic loop where it's going to cause that muscle then to have a quick contraction. Now again, to integrate what we saw on the earlier page, this is not the only, I have these DRGs doing it, but the DRGs also are going up to the brain and doing whatever they're doing. But the point of the drawing here is just to isolate. So you have that. And again, just to keep our orientation right, that's my dorsal horn, that's my ventral horn, or I could have said this is my posterior horn or anterior horn in terms of the butterfly that you see in the middle of a spinal cord. So you have that. And so then when you tap it, then that means this foot here is going to swing forward. Okay, so you're actually going to have an extension. Okay, this is what this is, an extension of the lower leg. Okay, so in muscle groups around joints, you have what is called antagonistic muscle groups. So if one group of muscles are going to be moving the joint one way, but then you have another group of muscles that are going to be moving the joint the other way. So in this case, in the cartoon here, you got your hamstrings. Well, your hamstrings are going to want to flex your lower leg. And so then the quadriceps are going to want to extend your lower leg. Well, you have to be mindful with these antagonistic groups, because when one group is going to contract, then you're going to want to inhibit the antagonistic group to facilitate the movement. So this is what gets kind of interesting, is that when you do the mallet, you give the little yank to the muscle spindles, which goes in, and again, by one synapse is going to cause that muscle to contract. You're actually also going to be causing this muscle group here to relax more. Now, this involves several neurons. So this guy comes here, he's going to be synapsing onto an interneuron or internunциal neuron, and that internunциal neuron then is going to release inhibitory neurotransmitters, probably glycine or GABA or something like that, and it's going to then shut down this motor neuron that's trying to get this muscle to contract here. So it's actually going to inhibit that muscle group. So I want to, with the mallet tap here, I'm going to stimulate this muscle group, and I'm going to want to inhibit this muscle group to facilitate that jerk or that extension you have with your lower extremity. So again, this is another example of how important it is for that proprioception associated with that muscle spindles into quadriceps, and then understanding its role in this particular type of reflex. Very common to do this test in clinic, because you're testing for the reflex. You have a normal degree of extension when you take the mallet and tap that tendon. And so what the physician is doing is she or she will look at it, and you could have an abnormally low reflex. That would indicate something. You could have an abnormally exaggerated reflex where the lower extremity kicks way up. Okay, that's another possible pathology. Or it could be within the normal range. So that's what they're looking for when they do this test. This is again called a deep tendon reflex, and this is in particular the patellar reflex arc, but you have deep tendon reflexes that you can do on many muscles, tendons in your body. You have deep tendon reflexes you could do on your upper extremity. You have deep tendon reflexes you can do on your jaw. There's something called a jaw jerk reflex. If you were to lower the patient, lower their jaw, you take a mallet and gently tap on the top of their bottom teeth, that jaw will jerk back. Same thing. Lowering the jaw, then you take the mallet, tap the jaw. Now you're giving a quick jerk to the muscle spindles that are associated with the muscles that close your jaw, and they're going to have a jerk. So there are many places around your body where you can test for a deep tendon reflex. And so this one particular here, it is a deep tendon reflex, specifically a patellar reflex. Anyway, so I hope you found that interesting, and we'll pick up next time. I want to spend some time talking about nociceptors or pain receptors. Nociceptors detect noxious stimulation in the body. And when they detect the noxious stimulation in the body, the person or the animal is going to be experiencing pain. Now, it's important to note that pain is a subjective experience that's a function of the higher brain centers. So I may have something going on in my skin, maybe a cut or a burn or something, and that input is going to stimulate a pain pathway that's going to make its way to my higher brain centers where I am consciously aware of the pain. So in a sense, that's where the pain is occurring, in my higher brain centers. It's very similar to if we talked about the retina and you have rods and cones, they're interacting with photons, but the visual experience that we have is not simply a function of photons interacting with rods and cones, but it is a function of neurocircuitry in the higher brain centers that's giving me the awareness of what I'm seeing. Sure, the rods and cones and retina are a necessary process for that visual pathway, but the actual experience of seeing occurs in my cortex. You could make that same point with any sensory information, whether it be taste or smell or whatever. The experience of it is purely a function of higher cortical functioning. So you have two basic components of pain perception. You have the degree, location of the pain. In other words, where am I experiencing pain? And again, that's going to be a function of the specific pathway of pain at a particular point in the body. And so maybe I am pricking my finger with a needle, and so that finger is going to be experiencing pain, but not really. See, I'm experiencing pain. It's in the cortex, but the pathway that is stimulated by the needle prick in the fingertip is going to give me the sense, oh, my finger is in pain. So we're very good at localizing some kinds of pain, like a needle prick or something like that. Also, we're pretty good at the degree. So how much is this hurting? So the degree and the localization, again, a function of part of the higher cortical region. So I'm going to put that in one bucket, which is going to be the degree/localization. The other component of pain perception has to do with the emotional overlay involved. So best illustrated with this little diagram here. If I were to have some type of pain stimulation, so I'm going to have my primary sensory neuron is going to be having action potentials, and it's going to be connecting to a secondary sensory neuron in the CNS. In the CNS, by CNS, we're talking about either the spinal cord or we're talking about the brainstem. Now, we would be talking about the brainstem if we're talking about nerves that are associated with the cranial nerves. But other than the cranial nerves, then we're talking about spinal cord. So that's going to be the entry point for the location for the secondary sensory neurons. So those neurons are going to be stimulated, which will stimulate another set of neurons and another set of neurons until eventually you're going to have some of the neurons are going to be communicating what's going on out here to higher cortical areas for conscious appreciation of the pain. And we're talking again, where is the pain and what's the intensity of the pain? You have another set of neurons, though. They're going to be communicating with another part of your brain called the limbic system. So I'll just add system here. And the limbic system is a fancy way of saying the part of the brain that is involved in my emotional response. Your limbic system is all about your emotions. So you kind of have a dual pathway. So you have a pathway that tells you where it is and what the intensity is, and then you have a separate pathway that is going to have you associate a particular emotion with that pain. And the emotion is a sense of disagreeableness, a sense of I don't like that kind of thing. So there is this dual pathway involving pain. It is the conscious awareness of pain, localization degree, and then the fact that it upsets me. In other words, it has an emotional valence associated with it. What is interesting is that there are some pathologies, usually because of a stroke or something like that, where the stroke, if it's occurring in a certain area of the brain itself, may interrupt that pathway from pain to the limbic system. And this is rare, but if those individuals then experience pain, what they'll report is they'll say, yes, it hurts. It may hurt very badly, but it doesn't bother me. In other words, there's no emotional component to it, so they're not particularly bothered by it, even though they'll report that it hurts, and they can tell you exactly where it hurts. Now, I have no way of relating to that. I have no idea how one could do that, but it has been documented in the literature that occasionally you'll have a situation where that is the case. So again, take-home point here is that when we're talking about pain, we're talking about two components. We're talking about conscious awareness and degree, and then we're talking about the emotional component or the sense of disagreeableness with the pain. So again, very important concept. Now, going back to more general points, when we're talking about nociceptors or pain receptors and the pain pathway, we're talking about free nerve endings. And we've talked about this before. Free nerve endings are non-encapsulated. They are by far the most abundant nerve endings in your body. We have a little diagram here. Again, we have glabrous skin, we have hairy skin or hirsute skin, and you see the receptors that we've been talking about through the series of lectures. And here are our free nerve endings. The thing I don't like about the diagram is it looks like the free nerve endings are only in the hirsute skin or the hairy skin, that's not the case at all. I mean, you have free nerve endings everywhere, and they far outnumber all of the other receptors. So these are very, very busy types of nerve endings. And again, to remind you that free nerve endings not only convey pain, but they convey a lot of other modalities as well. I'll talk about that in a second. But going back to free nerve endings, we may recall that free nerve endings, you have basic two fiber types associated with it. You have your A deltas, and that's going to be your lightly myelinated fibers, and then you have your C fibers, which are non-myelinated. So if you have a free nerve ending, then we're talking about either A delta or we're talking about C fibers. Again, one of the modalities of these free nerve endings is going to be pain. And nociception pain is going to be a kind of pain. We're going to find out later that not all pain is nociception pain, but it is a kind of pain. And the nociception pain, or also nociceptive pain, that type of pain is defined as pain that is being generated from my body, from the peripheral system of my body, in response to some sort of interaction of these free nerve endings with the environment that would normally cause pain. That's classic nociception pain. And you can effect nociception pain in basically three different ways. It can be thermal, it can be mechanical, and it can be chemical. Now, I'm going to throw in there kind of under, sometimes we lump the following into chemical, sometimes not, but protons, okay, which is going to be pH, okay, that also can stimulate pain. It can also stimulate temperature. So sometimes you'll see in the literature where chemical and protons are separate, and sometimes they're kind of folded together, but you get the idea. So it's temperature, mechanical manipulation, and then chemical / pH protons. You're going to find these in these pain-free nerve endings. You're going to find them in skin, mucosa, visceral organs, blood vessels, connective tissue, muscle, bone, other specialized organs, eyes, ears, etc. So basically, free nerve endings are ubiquitous, and pain-free nerve endings are also ubiquitous. Interestingly enough, one of the rare parts of your body that don't have free nerve endings is actually your central nervous system. So your brain and spinal cord, there are no free nerve endings, so they are incapable of experiencing pain or anything else associated with free nerve endings because they're simply not there. Of course, you could come back and say, well, then, I have a headache. Why is my head hurting? Well, it's not your brain per se that's hurting, because your meninges, the connective tissue covering your brain itself, is rich in free nerve endings and rich in pain receptors. The meninges is covering your spinal cord, same thing. So when you have a headache, it's in all likelihood something to do with your connective tissue, your meninges, your dura mater, etc. in the brain or surrounding the brain. Also, you have some blood vessels that have free nerve endings. So blood vessels can hurt that are within the central nervous system. So when you have a, quote, central nervous system type of pain, it's not really that. It's really connective tissue around it or blood vessels and such. But the brain proper or the spinal cord proper in and of itself is basically, just has no way of sensing anything in terms of a primary manipulation. It's numb. You're not aware of any type of touching of brain or spinal cord. If we're just talking about the brain, the tissue proper. Free nerve endings are considered polymodal. I think you can kind of figure that out. Poly meaning, modal, different types. So free nerve endings, obviously, involved in pain. Free nerve endings are involved in itch. Again, itch is usually going to be involving free nerve endings and C fibers, temperature, of course. Light touch, so you're gently touching somebody. So sometimes this is called general tactile. You're aware that you're being touched. You're not sure about the quality of the touch or the nature of the touch, but you're aware of the touch. That's called light touch. These are a function of free nerve endings. Of course, you have mechanical input. It could be responding to pressure and stretch. So there are a lot of ways that the free nerve endings can communicate sensation. Again, polymodal. Now, what is interesting is that you have some pathway, say itch. Okay, so you have some C fibers. So that's its own pathway. And so if you were to have a free nerve ending here, and this is going to be a C fiber, okay, and this is going to be involving, an itch. Let me get that. ITC. Okay, itch, where it's going to have, again, a series of neurons that will make its way to the cortex and where you have the subjective experience of itch. So it's its own pathway. And then you may have another free nerve ending that may be giving you a sense of stretch. Okay, and so you have that, and it's free nerve stretch. Again, a series of neurons, and gets to the cortex, and you have the subjective experience of stretch. So what I'm saying is that the itch pathway is different than the stretch pathway. Now, a lot of this is not well worked out because it is possible that you could have the same pathway handling two different modalities. Again, that may be the case. It may not be the case. So there's a lot of ambiguity here. But what I'm not wanting to give you the impression of is that there's just like one pathway for all of these modalities. That simply is not the case. So following up on that point, I have a couple diagrams here for you that I want us to take a look at. And the first is this diagram here, non-noxious thermal pathway. In other words, I'm sensing cold, I'm sensing warm, but we're not getting into any type of pain. So what you would have is, again, you're going to have your primary sensory neuron. Again, it could be DRG, it could be a ganglia associated with a cranial nerve, but you're going to have some type of stimulation. It's going to be some thermoreceptor. We talked about that earlier lecture that's sitting on there. It may be cold, maybe hot. So that's going to be stimulated, and then you're going to have your CNS here, again, spinal cord or brain stem, and it's going to make its way to the cortex for conscious awareness of that particular sensation, whatever that is, whether it's cold or hot. But it's non-noxious, which means pain is not involved. Then, as you know, you can have temperature, extreme cold, extreme hot, that actually can induce pain. And my point to you is that that is a different pathway altogether. So we have the pain pathway down here, and imagine then the pain pathway is stimulated, in this case, by some TRPV1 receptors. So I'm going to have some TRPV1 receptors here, TRPV1 receptors sitting on there. And so when they are stimulated, you're going to have this, again, this pathway being stimulated, and you're going to have ultimate communication with the higher cortical regions and the limbic system, and you're going to have the subjective experience of pain. My point, though, is that just for an example, suppose you had TRP1 receptors up here, okay? Suppose they were, TRP1, or TRPV1, I mean, TRPV1 receptor sitting here, but they're associated with a free nerve ending that is in the non-noxious thermal pathway. Well, if we're talking TRPV1, we're talking warm. So that's going to give me the subjective experience of being warm once the signal reaches the higher cortical regions. So in this case here, the TRPV1, again, is just functioning as your thermal receptor. But if you have a TRPV1 and it's associated with a neuron that is a pain neuron, part of the pain pathway, then when it gets stimulated, it's going to be getting to the part of the brain that I will experience pain. The same thing would have been for cold. If I have something very cold that is painful, again, it is going to be involving the receptors for coldness that are also associated with pain. And again, it will then cause that pain pathway associated with extreme cold to be stimulated, and then I would have the subjective experience of that. Again, reminding you that the TRPV1 receptor is responsive to thermal. It's also responsive to chemical, and we'll talk more about that in the next section. It's also responsive to protons or pH. Usually we're talking about acid when we're talking about that. So that's what the V1 receptor is responsive to. So we have that. There are many other ways of affecting a pain pathway that has nothing or necessarily anything to do with thermal. You've got many nociceptors out there that are responsive to, again, mechanical manipulation, tissue injury, cuts, pokes, lots of other things that can cause pain that may not necessarily have anything to do with a thermal type of pain event. And so again, I'm talking a lot about the TRPV1. I'm mostly talking about the TRPV1 because it is one of the better well-characterized thermal receptor / nociceptive receptor. And again, that depends upon what kind of neuron it's sitting on. Is it sitting on a non-noxious thermal pathway neuron, or is it sitting on a pain neuron? Now, another point that I want to make regarding pain and temperature, and that is if you hold something that is slightly warm, then obviously you'll have a warm sensation. But if you have something that is warm to the point that is beginning to hurt, and that would just be slightly warmer, you're not damaging tissue, okay, but you are experiencing warmth and it is beginning to hurt a little bit, okay, that is, again, going to be very much involved with your TRPV1 activating now pain pathway. Same thing with cold. If you, say for example, if you went and put your hand in some water and the water was 40 degrees, it'll feel cold, but if you keep your hand in the water for 40 degrees long enough, it's going to begin to hurt. Now again, you're not damaging tissue, but it's going to hurt. So there you are activating a thermal pain pathway. So you've got that. Neither the heat nor the cold in my example that I'm giving you now is involving destruction of tissue. But if you were to, say, grab that hot pot sitting on a stove and you didn't know it was hot, and we've all done it, you grab it and it burns you very badly, and of course you're going to react, you're going to withdraw, and now you got big blisters on your fingers and such. Okay, that type of pain is mostly because of the tissue damage. You may have a small component of that that's going to be a thermal type of pain, But the fact that you're damaging the tissue, that's going to be the major driver of your pain experience when you grab that hot pot. It's mostly going to be because you've damaged tissue. And so that type of pain response has little to do with the TRPV1 and has everything to do with all of these other nociceptors that are sensitive to injury to tissue itself. On the other extreme, if you were to have a metal rod and you were to grab it and the temperature of the metal rod was, say, minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is really, really, really cold, you grabbing that metal rod is going to hurt. And again, the pain is mostly coming from the damage of the tissue and not particularly because you're activating thermal pain pathways. It's going to be other pathways, injured pain pathways that are involving what happens when you damage tissue, which is why when you grab something extremely hot, extremely cold, they kind of feel the same if they're really hurting you, because you're just basically activating a generic pain pathway involving anything that damages tissue. Okay, all nociceptive or nociception pain is conveyed by free nerve endings. Okay, somewhere in your body you are stimulating those pain-free nerve endings. Remember, many free nerve endings have nothing to do with pain, but you have a bunch of them that do. And so if you're stimulating those free nerve endings that are sitting or associated with pain neurons, primary sensory neurons, then you got nociception or nociceptive pain. You have basically two types of nociceptive pain. You have fast pain and slow pain. The fast pain, you're going to have free nerve endings that are being stimulated, but they're going to be associated with A delta fiber types. In other words, those are going to be slightly myelinated, so they're going to be relatively quick. And you will experience this as a sharp, well-localized pain, and these are rapidly adapting types of neurons. And so we've discussed this concept before, but it's more sensitive to a quick change, such as a sharp pain, well localized, but then it very quickly dies down, rapidly adapting. And then you have slow pain, and the slow pain, again, is going to be a function of free nerve endings associated with the C fibers. Now, the A delta fibers are about 10 times as fast as the C fibers. And so when you're experiencing pain as a function of what we call slow pain, these C fibers, that sensation is painful, but it's a dull, achy, less localized type of pain. Now that dull, achy, less localized type of pain can be very, very severe, but it has a different quality than that sharp, well-localized pain. Now, we've all experienced these two types of pains, fast pain, slow pain. We might not have had the vocabulary to articulate what we experienced, but I'll give you a couple of nice examples. I assume we have all walked through a room barefoot and at some point caught a toe on the corner of a table foot or a chair. We've all been there, so you bang your big toe, a really good one, and there is a slight delay between when you bang your big toe on the corner of the table foot, and when you experience the pain. In other words, again, you hit it, and it's just like if you played it in slow motion, it would be, okay, bang toe, wait for it, wait for it, wait for it, boom, now it hurts. You know, we have that delay. The reason there is a delay is because you are activating C fibers, and they're relatively slow. And the pain itself, again, is kind of an achy, very unpleasant type of pain. So contrast your personal experience with banging your big toe on the corner of a table versus walking through a room barefoot and stepping on a shard of glass or a tack. Well, that's a completely different experience. When you step on a shard of glass, there is no delay. That's a very, very quick experience. So that is classic fast pain. The shard of glass, you're going to experience sharp pain. You're going to know exactly where that glass is impaling your skin, and you're going to have a very quick reaction. And that's because, again, A delta fibers are being utilized with this. So that's fast pain and then slow pain. It's the difference between A delta fibers and C fibers, and they have different qualities. Now, the thing that I want to make sure you understand, though, is that in your skin, again, loaded with free nerve endings and loaded with free nerve endings that are functioning as pain neurons, these are all mixed in together. So when you step on that shard of glass and you experience that very sharp, well-localized pain, and it's causing you to withdraw, you're also going to be stimulating C fibers. And so that sharpness will go away quickly, but then it's going to be overlaid on top of that is it's going to be this dull, achy, very disagreeable pain. So these, the fast pain and the slow pain, they all work together. You have both of them just kind of intertwined on your organs. And so when you have, again, something happening on some part of your skin, and it is, sharp in nature, it also is going to involve the C fibers and that dull aching as well. So stepping on a tack or stepping on a shard of glass, you're going to have the fast pain, but intermingled in with it, you're going to have the slow pain as well, because when you step on that shard of glass, it's going to continue to hurt, and it's going to continue to hurt because slow pain is slow adapting fibers. In other words, it doesn't go away. So as long as you have the offensive object in your skin, it's going to hurt. And again, but it's going to be a different kind of hurt, and it's going to be slow adapters. Okay, so I think that's all I want to talk about this block, and we'll pick up on the next page next time. For this section, I want to focus more on the TRPV1 receptor. Not sure I've told you this before, but the TRP, the TRP, stands for transient receptor potential, and then the V is villonoid. You got all kinds of TRP receptors. We've got TRPV1, V2, V3, V4. You have the TRPM8. We talked about that earlier when we were talking about thermoreceptors and such. So again, these are villonoid receptors, and the TRPV1, along with many other nociceptors, they're going to be involved in initiating pain signal, depending upon the stimulus of the pain. But these receptors are located on free nerve ending pain neurons. These changes involve alterations in the flow of calcium and sodium, so that when the TRPV1 and some of these other nociceptors, they're interacting with whatever is stimulating them, they'll open up, calcium and sodium will flow in. That causes changes in the sensory neuron, altering action potential frequencies and such, and then you progress through the pain pathway to your cortical areas. We also had talked last time, or a couple times ago when we were doing thermoreceptors, that the TRPV1 can serve as a thermoreceptor. So it can serve as a thermoreceptor or it can serve as a nociceptor. That depends upon what type of neuron it is on. If it is on a thermoreceptor neuron, in this case a warm neuron, then that's all it does. It just communicates warmth in terms of your consciousness. But if the TRPV1 is sitting on a pain neuron, then when it is stimulated on that neuron, it's going to go through the pain pathway. You'll experience, of course, pain. I don't think it's surprising to you to hear me tell you that there's a higher threshold for the TRPV1s on the pain pathway. In other words, it takes more thermal energy to light off the pain pathway than it does just to have a subjective experience of warmth. But these TRPV1s that are associated with primary pain neurons, their job is to detect noxious heat. And noxious heat meaning this is going to harm my tissue or potentially harm my tissue. Again, there are other nociceptors that are involved with this and are also involved with noxious heat. TRPV1 is not the only one, but it certainly is one of the best characterized. Normally, you will start feeling pain when you are in contact with something around 115 degrees or higher. Then you begin to have pain. Now, if you're having pain with this type of temperature, you're not damaging tissue, but it will affect pain. The TRPV1 also mediates, again, as I said, non-thermal pain, such as chemical stimulation. Okay, so the TRPV1, again, as we've said before, it's not only responsive to just thermal, it is responsive to chemical, it's responsive to the proteins and such. So you'll recall our treatment that we had regarding capsaicin when we were doing the thermo lecture. So capsaicin, chemical, it can chemically interact with the TRPV1, giving you this sense of warmthness when you are taking in or eating chili peppers and such. Also, if the capsaicin is concentrated enough, it can interact with the TRPV1s that are associated with the pain pathway as well. So if there's a sufficient amount of capsaicin, then it can start interacting with the TRPV1s associated with the pain, and then all of a sudden those chili peppers that you're eating can actually cause pain of the tongue. We may have talked about this before, but again, this is why you put capsaicin in pepper spray, and you spray it in your eyes. It's going to hurt. So if your eyes are hurting, burning, most of that uncomfortableness is because the capsaicin is interacting with the TRPV1 receptors that are associated with the pain pathway. Interestingly enough, overstimulation of these receptors can actually desensitize the nerve fiber and will eventually degrade the free nerve ending. So someone who eats a lot of chili peppers, over time they'll degrade their free nerve endings and they will become desensitized to capsaicin, which then allows them to eat chili pepper, and their experience with the chili pepper is different than someone who's never had a chili pepper. They're not going to be burning as much, they're not going to have as much pain because they basically have changed the neurology of their own tongue and they've desensitized themselves to the capsaicin. Well, because capsaicin has that particular effect, it can actually be used as an analgesic. So you can put capsaicin in creams and such and rub it on area of the skin, and yeah, it's going to maybe burn or have a warmth, but you do repeated applications, eventually you're going to start degrading the free nerve endings there that are associated with pain and actually can help with pain. Noxious cold is a little different in the sense that, remember we talked about the TRPM8, and remember that's a melastatin category of receptor, not a vilanoid. But the TRPM8 is responsive to cold, and so if you're touching something cold, that is going to cause that receptor to open up, again cause the neurological pathway for perception of cold. What's different about the TRPM8 compared to the TRPV1 is that it is not thought that the TRPM8 is actually involved in nociception pain. Again, it's a little unclear, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for that, so some people think not. Of course, some people think it may be still an open question. Don't know. So if you're put your hand in a vat of water and the water is 35 degrees, it's going to feel cold, and if you leave it in there long enough, you're going to start having some pain. And so what I'm telling you is it is probably unlikely that the TRPM8 is going to be involved in that pain pathway. More likely that there are other nociceptive receptors that respond to cold that are less characterized. Now again, if you are taking and touching something that's really, really cold, like maybe a piece of metal that's sitting at minus 80 Fahrenheit, that type of uncomfortableness of pain that you're going to be getting by grabbing the bar, that's going to be a function, again, of you just basically injuring tissue, and not so much the fact that you're tripping off thermal receptors that happen to be associated with the pain pathway. Anyway, so that's that. Normal cold pain begins around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, 35, eventually you're going to have some pain, but you're not destroying tissue. So that's a different kind of pain than if you grabbed a piece of metal that was minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And we talked about this last time, but it's important again to note that extreme heat, extreme cold affects nociceptive pain mostly because you're damaging tissue, which is why extreme hot and extreme cold kind of feel the same in terms of the subjective experience of uncomfortableness. So in addition to mechanical issues that could be causing pain, or pH or protons, acid would cause pain, chemical again would cause pain, noxious thermal stimulation. Again, noxious thermal stimulation means pain. Other stimuli can initiate nociceptors in response, such as inflammation. And this is what I kind of want to focus on for the rest of this block here. We all know that if tissue is inflamed, it hurts. So what you have with an inflammation are a number of inflammatory cells releasing many, many factors that changes the nature of the tissue itself. And part of that change is going to cause or going to irritate these free nerve endings that have these, again, pain receptors on them. And the TRPV1 seems to be a major player in mediating pain that has to do with inflammation. And so we have a lovely cartoon here. And so we're going to say that this cartoon here is a free nerve ending. And on this free nerve ending, let's go ahead and stipulate that this is going to be a free nerve ending as part of your pain pathway. So this would be a free nerve ending, primary sensory for pain. Okay, so there's my TRPV1. Again, it interacts, and you're going to have calcium, and you're going to have sodium flowing in and then changing the nature or initiating a signal in the pain pathway. Okay, so you have that. So if you have an inflammation process, you're going to have all kinds of factors that are actually going to change the biology of this primary sensory neuron that happens to be associated with the pain pathway. So you got all of these factors here that are being released that are binding to the various receptors, again causing all kinds of things to go on inside the cell. And many things can go on here. One of the things that could go on is you could be changing the sensitivity of that TRPV1 such that you can make it so that it's going to be allowing more calcium, more sodium opening, which would enhance the signal. You could have cell biology changes where you're altering the number of the TRPV1 receptors associated with the membrane itself. So you have pathways that you could actually increase the amount of TRPV1 in the membrane. So the nature of the TRPV1 and the number of the TRPV1 receptors in the free nerve ending is under the control of the cell biology of that primary sensory neuron that is associated with the pain pathway. So here's my focus that I want to draw you to. And that is when you have an inflammatory process, one of the major players are prostaglandins. And so here is a prostaglandin there. The prostaglandin is being manufactured by inflammatory cells, released, and then it is interacting with that free nerve ending. And so it is causing changes in the cell biology that is influencing the activity, the sensitivity of the TRPV1 receptor, such that if I have large amounts of prostaglandins or if I upregulate prostaglandins, it sensitizes this free nerve ending, making it more prone to cause or to initiate a pain signal. So what's happening here is the prostaglandins plays a key role in pain. So if you want to address pain, and if the pain is originating from an inflammation, then one of the common drugs you give are going to be NSAIDs. And as I know you know, NSAIDs are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So if you're thinking NSAIDs, think something like aspirin. Okay, that's an NSAID. So what it's doing is it's tapping down the inflammation process, and part of the tapping down of the inflammation process is that it is going to lower the amount of prostaglandins that are being released. And if you can lower the amount of prostaglandins that are going to be released, that is going to cause these free nerve endings associated with the pain pathway to be less sensitive. So that's the mechanism of how NSAIDs can manage pain if the pain is a function of an inflammation. Now, I'm sure you've probably had this in other classes, but the way NSAIDs work is that they're going to be inhibiting the activity of a COX-1 or a COX-2 enzyme, or actually perhaps inhibiting both of them, so it could be or and. And the COX-1, COX-2 enzymes are really important for the manufacturing of prostaglandins. So if you interfere with the COX-1, COX-2, you're going to interfere with the production of the prostaglandins, meaning you're going to be inhibiting it. And if you inhibit it, then you get your analgesic effect or your pain reduction effect regarding the use of NSAID. So that's basically how that works. So note this is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, which means that steroids can also be used to manage pain. And so what steroids do across the board, they interfere at multiple levels in terms of the production of all these factors that are being released into the tissue in response to an inflammation. Steroids being steroids, that are going to go in and they're actually going to be altering the ability for genes to be making various key factors, proteins, enzymes, and such, which then in turn interferes with the production of all these cytokines. So giving someone steroids is a way of managing pain, but it's done in a secondary way. So the steroids interfere with the actual production of the cytokines, therefore reduces the prostaglandins, and therefore, again, can attenuate pain. So you've got a steroid approach of managing pain, and then you have the non-steroid approach of managing pain. But both of them, in terms of the pain, is going to be reducing the amount of prostaglandins being made. There are other medications that are commonly given, or classes of medications that are commonly given to manage pain. One of them is acetaminophen. And we get there. Okay, and you know that is, of course, Tylenol. That class of drugs actually does not do anything in the peripheral nervous system. Acetaminophen or Tylenol actually abates or reduces pain by working in the deep brain areas. Its mechanism is not particularly well characterized, but it's a completely different approach than the NSAIDs. And in fact, some people combine NSAIDs with acetaminophen. The NSAIDs are working on, again, the peripheral part of your body. Acetaminophen is working in your deep areas of your brain to try to tap down your brain, your pain perception. Of course, the other well-known category are going to be opioids. And opioids, many of them, oxycodone, fentanyl, you know all those drugs. They also work on pain by working on the central nervous system, so they could be working in areas of the spinal cord, they could be working in the areas of the brain proper, again, to dull pain down. I'm not going to go into all those mechanisms. That's fairly well worked out. There's plenty of things in the literature about that, but that's not the purpose of this lecture. So I guess generally what I'm saying is that these broad classes of drugs that address pain, steroids, NSAIDs, acetaminophen, and opioids. There are some other drugs that are out there as well, but these are kind of the biggies. What is interesting, though, is, again, we've talked a good bit about that TRPV1 being so much involved in pain. There's actually a lot of research going on trying to find drugs that could function as an antagonist to the TRPV1. And the idea is if you can somehow shut that down or inhibiting it, that it would then inhibit pain. And in fact, that is true. It can be very, very effective. The problem with these drugs as it stands now is you can give a drug that is antagonistic to the TRPV1 receptor, but it has so many other unintended side effects that it's not particularly useful as a drug in healthcare. Although there are drugs that are being tested trying to address the unwanted side effects, and so and they're in various states of trial. So it may be that one day they'll come up with some drugs that are classified as a TRPV1 antagonist that won't have the undesirable side effects. So that may come one day, but I don't think we're quite there yet. Going back to this cartoon, it is not my intent that you memorize that or that you memorize those or that you memorize all the stuff in the cell biology. The thing that I do want you to know, though, is I want you to know the role of the prostaglandins and the fact that it can alter the cell biology of the free nerve ending part of the pathway, and that it can alter then indirectly through cell biology the behavior of that TRPV1 receptor. So that part I do want you to know, and that the prostaglandins is a part of the inflammation process. Okay, so we'll end this here, and I'll see you next time. The last thing I want to talk about when we're discussing pain is called neuropathic pain. If you look at the term, you can sort of figure out what's going on there. That is an abnormal pain generated from the nervous system. In other words, you're not having anything in the tissue that is causing the pain. You're not having injury in the tissue. The pain itself is originating from the nervous system. It could be coming from the peripheral nervous system. It could be coming from the central nervous system. But it's coming from the nervous system itself, and it is not normal. So let's break this down into two groups. We have peripheral neuropathic pain. The source of this pain originates from the peripheral nervous system. In other words, those neurons associated with the DRG, or it could be the neurons associated with the pain in your cranial nerves that are innervating your head, your face, your mouth, or whatever else. But the problem is those primary sensory neurons. Something is off with them. So it could either be the peripheral nerve itself, or it could be a disease state that is affecting the peripheral nerves themselves. And some of the things that could cause these pain pathways or the pain primary sensory neurons to be acting out, it could be that you could be having an infection. It could be that you could have a metabolic disorder that is causing these primary sensory neurons to act out. There are certain inherited conditions that causes one to be prone to be very sensitive or to have abnormal pain associated with the peripheral nervous system. Diabetes is actually one of the most common causes for peripheral neuropathic pain. Diabetes, very complex process. Again, much is not understood about the effect of diabetes in your peripheral tissue in terms of how it is interacting with your pain neurons. But the diabetic state, particularly if it's uncontrolled, and when I'm talking about diabetes, I'm talking about type 1 diabetes, it actually will change the nature of your pain neurons, your primary sensory neurons, pain neurons. It causes them to act out in response to your diabetic condition. So for some patients that have diabetes, pain is a real problem. Then you have central neuropathic pain, and when I'm talking about central neuropathic pain, obviously we're talking about changes in the central nervous system. In central nervous system, we're talking about either an issue in your spinal cord or an issue in your brain itself. So what's happening is that the peripheral nervous systems are fine. Those primary sensory neurons, they're fine. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing, but when those primary sensory neurons activate the pain pathway in the central nervous system, It is the neurons in that pain pathway in the central nervous system that are doing something abnormal, causing you to have a sensation of pain when in fact there's no direct stimulus for the pain itself. You could also have a situation where you have mechanoreceptors in the peripheral nervous system, which normally do not have a nociceptive property. They can, in fact, affect pain in response to their A beta fibers. So again, just an example, you may have maybe some Pacinian corpuscles or the Ruffini's or something when they are being stimulated, and normally it would be no pain at all associated with that, and then that pathway then is activated and it's talking to the neurons in the central nervous system, which normally then should be just conveying a sense, hey, there's pressure here, that there's some type of interaction between that pathway and the pain pathway in the central nervous system where just a simple touch that you could be stimulating a Ruffini or stimulating a Pacinian corpuscle or something activates the pain pathway in the central nervous system. This is poorly understood. Nobody understands in a detailed way what's going on with that other than that is what is happening. So in that case, you could have, again, fiber types in the peripheral nervous system that normally have nothing to do with pain, example, A beta, and they are causing pain generated from the central nervous system in addition to your A deltas and your C fibers. Again, poorly understood, but something is gone awry in the central nervous system where it's taking normal sensation that should not be associated with pain, and it is somehow lighting off the pain pathway in the central nervous system. There are cases where your peripheral nervous system and the tissue, again, completely normal, but pain perception is present. Again, this is also called central pain. Okay, and the name is descriptive. The central pain meaning the pain is coming from the central nervous system, so the central pain would be a central neuropathic pain. Now, this is a special case here, though, because a person can have a stroke, and the end result of a stroke in either their spinal cord or their brain proper itself leaves them in a state of pain. In other words, a stroke has damaged some central nervous system tissue, and now the pain pathway is becoming active. And so that is a type of central pain. And so if you have central pain in response to a stroke, then what they would call that would be a central post-stroke pain. A subtype of this central pain is called thalamic pain. This is also called Dejerine-Roussy syndrome. Most of the time in the clinic you'll hear it as thalamic pain syndrome, but again that's kind of an older term, but it's in the literature. This is where you have a stroke that is involving the thalamus itself. So someone comes in, and the thalamic strokes are very common. So you have a stroke of the thalamus, and then after a few weeks, things begin to resolve, and now the patient begins to have pain. So again, this would be thalamic pain syndrome, kind of a subtype of a central post-stroke pain, because you can have central post-stroke pain with the stroke involving other areas, but if it's involving the thalamus, then typically it's going to be called your thalamic stroke syndrome. When you have these types of pathologies, anything can trigger the pain in the case of thalamic pain or even central pain as well. So sometimes what happens is the patient just has pain and they may be perceiving pain somewhere in their body. There may just be a vague sense of pain, but they're having pain. Other variations of this is that they could have pain in response to something that's going on the outside, but again, because you have this disruption of the pain pathway, they're going to experience pain. So someone with central pain or even thalamic pain, sounds could set off terrible pain, or they may have certain tastes that cause terrible pain for them. Some of them, a light touch, just a brush across the skin, would cause them to have awful pain. Or maybe they're responsive to cold or warm, or again, nothing at all. So again, very poorly understood, but something obviously has gone sideways in the central nervous system where, again, normal things that should have nothing to do with pain is making the patient have a pain perception. Two other common causes for neuropathic pain are multiple sclerosis. Again, you have a basic understanding of multiple sclerosis. It's an autoimmune issue where your immune system is attacking the oligodendrocytes in your central nervous system, attacking the myelin. That causes alterations in the brain itself. And not every person that has MS struggles with pain, but there are a percent of people with MS, they will struggle with some measure of central pain or central neuropathic pain. Another cause for central neuropathic pain is going to be spinal cord injury. There are some people, they injure their spinal cord, they may be in a wheelchair, their legs don't work, or if it's a spinal cord injury high up in the spinal cord, maybe in the cervical area, and maybe they're quadriplegic. But regardless, they have some type of spinal cord injury in a subpopulation of people that have spinal cord injury are going to report sometimes intractable pain, horrible pain, and that pain could be perceived as a burning pain or an aching pain. It may be localized in a particular area of the body. They may feel like that their feet are on fire. Again, nothing wrong with the feet, nothing wrong with the skin, but there's something in the spinal cord in response to the spinal cord injury that is, again, initiating that pain pathway. The problem with this is that central neuropathic pain is very, very difficult to treat. Even the best meds, opioids, and usually the opioid is about the most powerful you can do, but even the powerful opioids has a difficult time bringing this pain under control. It's very, very tragic and tough situation when you're dealing with people that have significant and severe central neuropathic pain because basically your toolkit is rather limited. Again, just a definition here, central neuropathic pain is not considered nociception pain. Okay, so nociception pain, that is going to be pain associated with tissue, that is causing a pain response. So if the person is having central neuropathic pain, that is not nociception pain. So the general point here is that nociception does not equal pain. Nociception or nociceptive pain or nociception pain is a kind of pain. So you can have or be in a pain state and it not be considered nociception. Because again, that has to be a peripheral issue or something in your tissue that's causing pain. I want to wrap up by defining two very important terms when we're talking about pathological pain. And these terms could be either associated with peripheral neuropathic pain or central neuropathic pain. And these two terms are called allodynia and hyperalgesia. Let's take allodynia first. Allodynia is a pain perception to a stimulus that would not normally cause pain. Maybe a light touch to the skin, or we talked about up here, sensitive to sounds or taste or whatever else in terms of the central neuropathic pain. So allodynia is where you're having some stimulus coming into the body that should not be associated with pain at all, and all of a sudden now the patient has pain. Poorly understood. Again, allodynia could be associated with peripheral neuropathic pain, or it could be associated with central neuropathic pain. There's a condition called cold allodynia, and that is where the patient is experiencing pain in response to cold temperature that is quite normal and normally not causing pain. In other words, maybe something is just slightly cool. Maybe you just touch something that is 55 degrees, and your normal response is, this is cool. But someone who has cold allodynia would touch that cold piece of metal, and it would cause them excruciating pain. Again, poorly understood. What's going on there? Nobody knows. But that, again, that would be the case there, where the allodynia is actually tied to thermoreceptors. Again, mechanism poorly understood. Again, some allodynia has to do with some type of abnormality in your primary sensory neurons. Some allodynias are having to do with something in your central nervous system. Again, it's again poorly understood and hard to treat, to be honest with you. Okay, so that's allodynia. Another term is going to be hyperalgesia. Hyperalgesia is where you're taking and you're doing something to tissue that normally causes pain, but the pain is exaggerated. So in this situation here, it was, again, I'm doing something to you and it causes pain, but the pain is much more intense than it would normally be, hence the word, hyper. You're having an exaggerated response to pain. This pain could be sharp, stabbing pain, it could be achy pain, burny pain, who knows. Again, you could have hyperalgesia that could be based in a peripheral neuropathic situation, or you could be having hyperalgesia in response to a central neuropathic pathway. Again, it could be associated with either one. Hyperalgesia actually has a purpose. If you have, say, a bruise, and of course bruises hurt, and then if you're touching and you're manipulating, okay, that's going to hurt, but it's going to be an exaggerated type of hurt. So the nature of the pain, neurons themselves in a bruise are really hypersensitive. And that's basically your body saying, don't mess with this tissue, it is injured. So actually hyperalgesia or some types of hyperalgesia can actually serve a useful purpose in protecting injured tissue. The allodynia serves no purpose at all. It's just there, and again, very poorly understood. Okay, well, I hope you've kind of enjoyed this romp through pain. A lot of things involved here. Again, there's much to learn in science about pain, but hopefully you have a better sense of what pain is now. See you next time. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about nociception, in this case pain, its involvement with a withdrawal reflex. We have all had the experience maybe having a pot or something on the stove. You thought it was normal temperature, you grab it and it's hot. And you know what happens. You, with lightning speed, withdraw from the hot pot. Well, obviously, the hot object, we're talking about nociception, we're talking about a pain, nociception pain. So you grab the hot plate or whatever is hot. What's going to happen is you're going to have, again, the DRG is going to be detecting pain. Okay, it's hot. It's going to be going back, and it's going to synapse onto a secondary sensory neuron. And that neuron then is going to talk to some other neurons. In particular, it's going to talk to the neuron that is responsible for the muscle to contract to pull your hand away. Okay, now this is an oversimplified drawing because, as we saw in the patellar reflex and the deep tendon reflex, you're going to have some circuitry going in and inhibiting the antagonistic muscle piece of it, but that's not what's in this diagram, and that's really not the point. The point being is that you burn your finger. It's going to go straight to the spinal cord, and through a series of internuncial or interneurons, it's going to lead to a contraction of that muscle there. What is really interesting about this, though, is you have your receptor here. This comes in and synapses on some internuncial or interneurons that's going to lead to the contraction of that muscle. But again, these things also will connect with other neurons that are going to send the pain signal up to your brain for conscious appreciation for the pain or the burning sensation on the tip of your finger. What's really interesting about this is that this piece right here, going from here, and then back to contract that muscle, is faster than even the fast pain that you have in response to grabbing the hot pot. Okay, and this fast pain, it's going to be your A deltas. going to zip on up there. So it is the case that you are pulling your hand away from the hot object before you're aware of the pain. That's how quick this system is. And so because we're dealing with A delta fibers and not C fibers, you don't perceive the lag. But there is a lag. So you grab a hot pot, you're pulling away just a few milliseconds before you actually are aware that you touched something hot. So I think that's kind of cool. But that is involving a withdrawal reflex. What is also really kind of interesting is you can have a withdrawal crossed extensor reflex. Now, this situation here, again, this is spinal cord, this is dorsal, this is ventral, or we could say this is posterior, this is anterior, and you got your dorsal horn and your ventral horn of your spinal cord. So imagine that we just kind of extend this down here, and you got a foot, okay? That's my foot. And suppose you were to take and step on a tack on that foot. Well, reflexively, you're going to pull that foot away. You're going to flex that lower leg, and you're going to pull it off the tack. So again, what you have here is you're going to have your pain. There's your DRG there. It's going to come in, and this is my secondary sensory neuron, and it is going to be talking to other interneurons, and so some of the interneurons is going to be causing a contraction, in this case the semitonotus muscle, which is going to flex your lower leg, and at the same time it's going to inhibit your rectus femoris muscle. So again, creating an optimum situation where you can move that leg that way or move that lower leg, flexing it, in response to this pain here. Again, a lot of complicated neurology in the gray matter here of the spinal cord. Again, what's not in the drawing is the tack that you're stepping on is also going to be sending fibers up to your brain so that you can have conscious appreciation of the tack that you stepped on. But again, like the hot pot, you're going to be pulling your foot away before you actually are having an awareness that you stepped on the tack itself, because this is a spinal cord reflex. So this drawing here is a little more involved than the one up here, because it actually depicts what's going on the antagonistic muscle group in terms of inhibiting that and stimulating that. Well, if you think about it, in terms of how would this work in real life, if you're walking along and you step on a tack and you pull back that foot that landed on the tack, you're going to fall on the ground because you need both you need both legs to stand upright, or at least an adjustment of one leg if you're going to stand on one leg. So this is where the crossed extensor reflex comes in. So the withdrawal reflex is this piece over here. What also is going to happen when you step on that tack, not only are you going to be coordinating muscles in terms of withdrawal, you're going to have the opposite going on over here. So what's going to happen here is that it's going to cause I'll just go a different color. It is going to cause a stimulation of that and an inhibition of that. That's going to then cause your other leg to stiffen up. And so these work together. So you're pulling back your leg, the foot that you stepped on the tack, and reflexively on the other side of the spinal cord, that other lower extremity is going to tighten up to stabilize you so that you don't do a face plant when you step on a tack. And again, this happens with lightning speed. All of this happens before you're aware that you even stepped on something sharp. So this is called a withdrawal cross extensor reflex. Extensor meaning I'm extending my leg, tightening it up. Cross meaning it's going to be the other leg. So if I step on a tack on my right leg, it's going to be my left leg that's going to stiffen up so that I don't fall down and my right leg will withdraw. Anyway, some cool reflexes in response to pain stimulation. See you next time. So I want to finish up the sensory section looking at a phenomenon called pain gating. What pain gating is, it is your nervous system's way of reducing the amount of pain in response to a pain signal. In other words, you have some nociceptive pain, you have some injury somewhere in your body. it's lighting off a pain signal so that you're perceiving pain. Your central nervous system actually has a way of lowering that pain so that it is not as painful as it could be. And so when it does that, we call that pain gating. So there are a couple of ways that your central nervous system can do this. So let's go ahead and get going and see how this all works. It's really kind of cool. You got a cross section of a spinal cord, of course, and here is the dorsal, or we could say the posterior. Here's the ventral, or we could say anterior. So we have our dorsal horn, ventral horn, and such. Okay, so we have our dorsal root ganglia sitting over here. So imagine that we have, again, a pain free, a nerve-free ending or free nerve endings, and these are ones that are happening maybe associated with pain, so they're nociceptives. So you have a pain stimulus, so now I'm going to be having action potential, increased action potential frequencies. They're going to go into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and they're going to release neurotransmitter onto a secondary sensory neuron. Now this drawing here, it's oversimplified. This drawing here has that secondary neuron crossing to the other side and ascending. For some of them, they'll do that. For others, these guys will actually synapse onto a neuron, and it will then synapse to a neuron, and then it will go across. So again, the drawing's oversimplified, but that's not really what I'm after here. The big take-home point is you have pain, it synapses on a secondary neuron, and eventually the signal crosses the other side and then heads up towards the brainstem. So that's that. So what will happen from here, if I could just draw this in order for you to be aware of the pain, this is going to go up, and it is going to eventually make its way to the thalamus. And then the thalamus is going to be sending a signal to your cortex that has to do with localization of the pain, the degree of pain. Neurons in your thalamus are going to be eventually sending signals to your emotional part of your brain so that you have a sense of disagreeableness of having this pain. It upsets you emotionally. Again, everything I'm telling you here is oversimplified because there are multiple neuronal chains involved in this. So again, oversimplified, but you get my point. So much of the signal goes to the thalamus. Thalamus then projects to the emotional part of your brain and then to the cortex for localization and intensity. So you have that going on. And so when you get to this, then all of a sudden now you are aware that you're in pain, and here makes you very upset about that fact. Well, these aren't the only signals that go up from this ascending pain signal. So you also are going to have some neurons that are going to peel off, or some axons that will peel off, and they will synapse onto some neurons in your brainstem. Okay, these little guys right there. And then those neurons are going to then in turn come down and will send a signal, and they will then synapse onto this little guy right there, and that's going to be an interneuron, a little guy. And this interneuron is actually going to be releasing neurotransmitters on the presynaptic terminal of this neuron here. And when it does that, it is going to then inhibit the activity of this neuron here, causing a reduction in the neurotransmitters released here, which in turn causes a reduction in the signal going up to the brainstem. So it's a little bit of a loop. So you've got pain going on here, it goes up, talks to the thalamus, talks to the cortex, talks to the emotions, you got pain, also talks to neurons in the brainstem sends those neurons back down and basically taps down the signal by working with this interneuron. So let's do a zoom so we can have a little better detail on this. So I've got a zoom cartoon here. The unfortunate thing is that it's flipped. So here I've got the pain coming in from this side. Here I have the pain coming in from the other side. So let me just go ahead. There's my neuron there. Okay, and that's going to be my nerve-free endings there that happen to be conveying pain. So this neuron is coming in. This is my secondary neuron right there. Okay, so this guy is going to cross and go to the other side and will eventually again go to the brainstem, go to the thalamus and such. So you have that going on. So now I have pain coming in. It's releasing on this secondary neuron. This little cartoon here says SP. That means substance P. And substance P is the neurotransmitter that is used when you have pain signal coming in from your body. Now, substance P is used in many systems in your body. You find it through your GI tract. Substance P does a lot of different things. But the neurotransmitter substance P, when it comes to pain, that's what it does. Substance P is released onto these neurons here, and then when you stimulate these neurons here, that is part of a pain signal. So stimulating these neurons means you're going to feel pain. So the more substance P that's being released, the greater the frequency of this pain neuron here, and the greater you're going to have and experience a course of pain. So that's that. So remember that we have these neurons sitting up here in the brainstem. Well, we have them here as well. So I'm going to go up, 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 up. Okay, neurons in the brainstem. Okay, so there. Okay, brainstem. These guys are sending their axon down, and here it is. That's the neuron there that's coming from the brainstem, and it is releasing 5-HT. And you know 5-HT is serotonin. So serotonin is going to be released here, and of course you have your 5-HT receptors onto this interneuron. Okay, so this interneuron there, that was the same as this little guy right there, okay? So you can make the connection here. So that interneuron, when stimulated by the serotonin, is going to be releasing, and in the diagram here says ENK. That means that is enkephalin. And enkephalin is an opioid. Okay, it's an endogenous opioid. So that enkephalin then binds to an opioid receptors on the presynaptic terminal of this DRG neuron here that's specializing in pain signals. And as the enkephalin binds to the opioid receptors, it is going to be reducing the amount of calcium going in there, which means it's going to be reducing the amount of substance P that is being released, which means it's going to be reducing the intensity of the signal from this pain neuron, this secondary neuron here. So that's kind of a little more of a focus, kind of a zoom in on what's going on here. You see this term here, substantia gelatinosa. The substantia gelatinosa is just a nucleus in the spinal cord, and it's just in this area right there. And substantia gelatinosa, it is very much involved in pain processing of the spinal cord. Okay, so that's what we call that. So this is basically a way for your central nervous system to loop back and to gate the pain. In other words, it taps down the pain. Whatever pain you had in response to a stimulus on your skin or wherever it's coming from, this system here, particularly if the pain becomes intense, this system here is going to start working. And so whatever degree of pain you have, it could be worse if this system here wasn't there. So the degree of pain, even though you feel like it really, really hurts, it could be worse. You're experiencing pain after the pain gating. So this is a really neat, clever way of the central nervous system kind of dialing down the intensity of pain that you have. So that's a major, major way of dialing pain down. Now, you'll note then when we talked about the opioid receptors and the enkephalin, as you know, morphine is an opioid. So what happens if you have a patient and they have a localized pain and you want to help them with that pain, but you don't want to blast them with body-wide opioids, you can actually run a little cannula into the spinal cord of interest, or the area of the spinal cord that's responsible for whatever pain is going on with your patient. You can run a little cannula in here and then start releasing morphine onto that little area in the substantia gelatinosa. That morphine will then bind to these opioid receptors and will really do a nice job of putting the brakes on that substance P being released. So this is kind of one of the ways that an opioid like morphine could work if it's localized. Okay, there is another way that we can have pain gating, and this is super cool. So, have you ever been in a room, turned around, banged your elbow, really banged it, so now your elbow is hurting so bad? And so what is your natural response to when you bang your elbow? You reach around and you rub the elbow, and somehow rubbing the elbow makes it feel a little bit better. What I'm going to tell you here is that's plain good neuroscience. It is not psychological. You are actually participating in your own pain gating when you do a rubbing of an elbow. So let's go back to these two drawings here and see what's going on. So got to kind of have the macro view over here. So you have some type of pain event. And so now you're going to rub your elbow. So this is rubbing. So rubbing, you're working on those mechanoreceptors in your skin. And so if they're mechanoreceptors, that means they're going to be A betas. Now there's some debate in the literature whether free nerve endings are involved in this too. If free nerve endings were involved, that obviously would be A delta. But people argue about that, but nobody argues the fact. Everybody understands that at least these mechanoreceptors are involved. So you're going to rub the mechanoreceptors, and so you're going to have action potentials, then coming down here, and then note what's going on here. And I'm going to clean this up so you can see it better. Okay. So I am releasing neurotransmitters, and guess what it's being released on? It's being released on that interneuron. And when that interneuron is stimulated, what is it doing? It is releasing enkephalin, which then is going to suppress the amount of substance P being released. So the fact that you're rubbing your elbow after you bang it to reduce the pain, basically you're self-medicating with an opioid. So here's a little zoom here, yeah, right there. Okay, we'll finish this in. So there's my DRG, and this is going to be my mechanoreceptor. So I'm going to be doing rubbing here. And action potentials, it's going to release neurotransmitters onto that interneuron, which is going to in turn release the enkephalins, again dialing down the substance P. So that's the neurological basis for rubbing your elbow. So the next time you rub your elbow, or next time you bang your elbow, just rub, 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 because now you know the neuroscience behind that. Okay, I thought that was kind of cool. So we'll end our sensory section with this little bit of information, and we'll carry on the next topic next time.